Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. This was back in 1993, during our family's summer road trip. Dad had gotten 2 weeks off from the factory, and Mom had convinced him we should drive to Oregon to visit my aunt, instead of just staying home in Nebraska like we usually did. I was 9 years old, excited about seeing mountains for the first time and getting to swim in the Pacific Ocean. We'd started our drive early that morning, around 5 a.m. Dad always liked to beat the traffic, even though we lived in a small town where traffic meant waiting for 2 cars at a stop sign. That was just how he was, always planning, always calculating the best way to do things. Mom had packed sandwiches and snacks so we wouldn't have to stop much. My little sister Kathy was 7, and she spent most of the day coloring or playing with her Barbies in the back seat of our old Chevy station wagon. By nightfall, we were somewhere in Idaho. I remember Dad saying we were making good time, that we'd push through a bit longer before finding a motel. Mom had fallen asleep around 10, her head resting against the passenger window. Kathy was out cold too, curled up on her side of the back seat with her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. I tried to stay awake, wanted to see everything, but eventually the rhythmic sound of the tires on the road and the soft country music playing on the radio lulled me into that half-asleep state where you're still somewhat aware of what's happening around you. It must have been between 2 and 3 in the morning when it happened. The inside of the car was dark, except for the green glow from the dashboard. I remember the heater was running because it had gotten chilly. My head was resting against the window, and I was drifting in and out of consciousness when I felt the car slow down a bit as we rounded a curve. Something made me sit up and look out the window. Maybe it was the change in speed, or maybe it was something else, some sense that something was out there. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense forest on either side of the narrow 2-lane highway. There were no other cars around, no lights from houses or buildings, just us, the road, and the wilderness. That's when I saw it. About 30 or 40 feet ahead, something stepped onto the road from the right side. At first, my sleepy brain thought it was a person. It was walking upright on 2 legs, but immediately I knew that wasn't right. It was too big, too different. I remember pressing my face against the window, suddenly wide awake. The creature was covered in dark hair. Not fur exactly, but hair that seemed to hang from its body. It was hard to tell the exact color in the headlights, but it looked dark brown or maybe black, and it was tall, really tall. Looking back now, I'd guess at least 7 or 8 feet, but to my 9-year-old self, it seemed like a giant. Dad slammed on the brakes. I lurched forward, catching myself on the front seat. The sudden movement woke Mom, who let out a startled, "What? What's happening?" But Dad didn't answer her. He was staring straight ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The creature didn't run, or even look startled by our headlights. That's what was so strange. It just continued walking, took 2 massive strides across the road, strides that would have taken a normal person 4 or 5 steps to cover the same distance. Its arms were long, unnaturally long, hanging down past its knees, but they swung naturally, like this was just a casual stroll. I could see muscle moving under that hair, not fat, not loose skin, but defined muscle that rippled as it walked. Its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, without much of a neck. I don't remember seeing its face. It never turned toward us. And then, just like that, it disappeared into the trees on the other side of the road. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than 5 or 6 seconds, but time seemed to slow down during those moments. Our car came to a complete stop in the middle of the highway. The only sound was the idling engine and the radio playing softly. I remember it was Garth Brooks singing "The River." Mom was looking at Dad, confused. "Frank, what is it? Did you see a deer?" Dad didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring at the spot where the creature had vanished. Finally, he muttered something like, "Just a bear, I think," standing up. But I knew it wasn't a bear. I'd seen bears at the zoo. This wasn't that. "Dad," I said, my voice sounding small in the quiet car. "That wasn't... We don't talk about this, got it?" He cut me off, looking at me in the rearview mirror. His eyes were wide, and I could see sweat on his forehead, even though the night was cool. Nothing to talk about, probably just a bear. Mom looked back at me, then at Dad. "Frank, you're scaring him. What happened?" "Nothing happened," Dad insisted, putting the car back in drive. "Just thought I saw something on the road. Everyone go back to sleep. We've still got a long way to go." And that was it. We drove on. Kathy hadn't even woken up during the whole thing. I couldn't fall back asleep, though. I kept staring out the window into the darkness, half expecting to see the creature again. My heart was racing, and I had this weird feeling in my stomach. Not exactly fear, but something else. Like I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see. The rest of the trip to Oregon was normal. We spent a week at my aunt's place near Portland, went to the beach, visited some waterfalls. Dad seemed to forget about what happened, or at least he pretended to. He never brought it up, and when I tried to ask him about it a few days later when we were alone, he just said, "Drop it, buddy. It was just a bear, okay?" But I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright for that long. They don't have that body shape. They don't move like that thing moved. For years, I didn't tell anyone else about what I'd seen. What was the point? Dad had made it clear we weren't supposed to talk about it, and I was just a kid. Who would believe me anyway? It wasn't until I was in high school that I came across an article about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. There was a drawing that made my blood run cold. It looked so similar to what I'd seen that night on the road. The long arms, the way it walked, the overall shape. That's when I started researching, reading everything I could find about Bigfoot and Sasquatch legends. When I was 19, I finally brought it up with my mom. We were alone in the kitchen during a holiday break from college, and somehow we got on the topic of that Oregon trip. "Mom," I said, trying to sound casual, "do you remember that night in Idaho when Dad slammed on the brakes because there was something on the road?" She was quiet for a moment, her hands pausing as she kneaded dough for Christmas cookies. "Yes," she said finally, "I remember." "It wasn't a bear, was it?" She looked at me, then glanced toward the living room where Dad was watching TV. "Your father doesn't like us talking about that night." "But you saw it too, right?" She sighed. "I only caught a glimpse when I woke up. It was big. Walking on two legs. That's all I saw before it was gone." "Why doesn't Dad want to talk about it?" She went back to kneading the dough, her movements a little more forceful than before. "Your father is a practical man. He doesn't like things he can't explain, and whatever that was, well, he couldn't explain it. So in his mind, it didn't happen." She looked at me again. "Why are you bringing this up now?" I told her about my research, about how what we saw matched descriptions of Bigfoot. She listened without interrupting, then said, "Maybe, or maybe it was something else. Either way, your father's right about one thing. Talking about it doesn't change anything." But she was wrong. Talking about it, acknowledging it, did change things, at least for me. It validated what I'd seen, confirmed I hadn't imagined it or dreamed it. I'm 35 now, with kids of my own. I've never seen anything like that creature since that night. I've been camping dozens of times, hiked in remote areas, even went back to Idaho once in college specifically to explore those forests. Nothing. Sometimes I wonder if I really did see what I think I saw. Memory is a funny thing, especially childhood memory. But then I remember how real it was, the way its muscles moved under its hair, the casual confidence in its stride, how it didn't even acknowledge our presence. Those details are too specific, too consistent to be something my mind made up. Dad passed away 3 years ago. At his funeral, Uncle Jim, his brother, pulled me aside and asked if Dad had ever told me about that thing they saw in the woods when they were teenagers. Apparently, they'd had their own encounter back in the 60s while hunting in northern Minnesota. Dad had never mentioned it to any of us. Uncle Jim said Dad had made him promise never to talk about it, just like he'd made us promise that night in Idaho. I often think about what it was doing out there on that empty highway in the middle of the night. Where was it going? Did it have a family, a home? Was it as surprised to see us as we were to see it? I don't have answers. All I know is what I saw. A massive, hair-covered creature walking upright across a highway in Idaho, illuminated briefly in our headlights before disappearing back into the wilderness. It was real. It happened. And no matter what my father wanted, I can't pretend it didn't. Sometimes when I'm driving at night on a lonely road, I catch myself scanning the tree line, wondering if I'll ever see it again. Part of me hopes I do. Part of me hopes I don't. Story 2. I've kept this story bottled up for over 20 years now. I'm not a big believer type. I'm actually pretty skeptical about most paranormal stuff, but what happened that weekend in October of 2002 still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. My buddy Carl and I decided to do a weekend camping trip in the Sabine National Forest in East Texas. We were both in our mid-20s, had decent outdoor experience, and wanted to get away from everything for a few days. We picked a primitive campsite about 15 miles northeast of Hemphill, right near the Sabine River. The appeal was its remoteness, no facilities, no crowds, just us and nature. We arrived Friday afternoon around 3 o'clock. The weather was perfect, that crisp October air where it's cool but not cold. We had my old Toyota 4Runner packed with gear, tent, cooler full of beer and food, fishing poles and a small portable stereo. Nothing fancy, just the basics. The drive-in was rough. The Forest Service road was barely maintained, more like a trail with 2 tire tracks and overgrown brush scraping both sides of the vehicle. We hadn't seen another car for the last 5 miles. Eventually, we found the small clearing we were looking for about 50 yards from the riverbank. We spent the afternoon setting up camp, gathering firewood, and exploring a bit of the area. The forest was dense, tall pines with a mix of oak and other hardwoods. The underbrush was thick in spots, making it hard to move through unless you stuck to the established trails. It felt isolated in the best way possible. As evening approached, we got a fire going and cracked open some beers. I remember feeling really content, watching the flames and listening to the forest sounds around us. Carl had put on some Leonard Sky Nerd on the little stereo we brought, and we were just bullshitting about work and life. That's when I first noticed something felt off. It was probably around 7:30 or 8. The forest had gotten quiet, and I mean completely silent. No crickets, no frogs from the river, no distant owl calls, nothing. It happened so gradually that I didn't immediately register it, but once I did, I couldn't unhear the silence. "Hey, you notice that?" I asked Carl. "Notice what?" "Listen, there's no sounds, nothing." Carl cocked his head, taking a pull from his beer. "Huh, weird." We both sat there for a minute, just listening to the unnatural quiet, broken only by our crackling fire and the low music. I was about to chalk it up to some normal forest thing I didn't understand when we heard it. From across the river, maybe 200 yards away, came this sound. It's hard to describe exactly, but it was like a deep, controlled howl that started low and rose in pitch before ending in something like a whoop or bark. It wasn't a coyote or a wolf. I know those sounds. This was different, bigger somehow. "The fuck was that?" Carl whispered, sitting up straight. I shook my head, feeling the hairs on my arms stand up. "Turn the music down." Carl reached over and twisted the volume knob. That's when we heard another call, similar but slightly different, coming from the opposite direction downstream. "That's not the same one," I said quietly. "No shit." We sat completely still, eyes straining into the darkness beyond our firelight. Then it happened. A third call, so loud and so close it made my heart slam against my ribcage. This one came from maybe 35 yards away, right near the river's edge. It was this powerful, rumbling vocalization that actually echoed off the surrounding trees. It didn't sound threatening exactly, but it seemed purposeful, like it was announcing itself. Carl and I exchanged glances. Without speaking, we both reached for our flashlights. I clicked mine on and pointed it toward where the sound had come from, but the beam only penetrated about 20 yards into the darkness before dissipating. "Should we pack up?" Carl whispered. I was about to answer when another call came from upstream, maybe 100 yards away. This sounded like a response to the closer one. Then the weirdest part of the whole experience started. The two began what I can only describe as a conversation. The vocalizations changed. They weren't just howls anymore, but included low grunts, some higher-pitched, almost cackling noises, and these rhythmic patterns that sounded disturbingly like speech, not human speech, but structured communication. "Are you recording this?" I whispered to Carl. "With what? It's 2002, man. My Nokia doesn't even have a camera." The exchange between the two creatures, I don't know what else to call them, continued for maybe 5 minutes before they seemed to move upstream, their calls becoming fainter until we couldn't hear them anymore. We sat in silence for at least 30 minutes afterward, both of us afraid to be the first to speak. The fire had died down to embers, but neither of us wanted to get up to add more wood. "What do you think that was?" Carl finally asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Bears don't make sounds like that. Cougars don't either." "It sounded intelligent," Carl said, and I knew exactly what he meant. We decided to stay put. It was too dark to pack up safely, and our car was parked about a quarter-mile away on the service road. Moving through unfamiliar forest at night seemed more dangerous than staying where we were. We built the fire back up as big as we could and took turns keeping watch while the other tried to sleep in the tent. Around 2 in the morning during my watch, I heard loud splashing from the river. It sounded like someone was throwing massive rocks into the water. Splash, splash, splash. 3 distinct impacts. Then came one final vocalization, similar to what we'd heard earlier but more distant, before silence returned to the forest. I didn't wake Carl. I just sat there clutching my flashlight and pocket knife until dawn started to break. When morning finally came, the forest seemed normal again. Birds were singing, squirrels chattering. If it weren't for the look on Carl's face, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. "Let's check the river," I suggested after we'd made coffee. Neither of us had much appetite for breakfast. We walked down to the riverbank, where we thought the closest calls had come from. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt and pine needles, so there weren't any clear footprints. But as we followed the narrow trail that ran parallel to the water, we found something strange. A large, soggy log had been placed across the path. It was about 8 feet long and thick as my thigh, much too heavy for one person to move easily. I'm certain it hadn't been there the previous evening when we explored the area. "Someone playing a prank?" Carl suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Out here, we haven't seen another soul since we arrived." We decided to stay one more night since we'd planned a weekend trip. That day was uneventful. We fished a bit, hiked a short trail, but stayed closer to camp than we'd originally intended. Neither of us mentioned what had happened the night before, as if talking about it would somehow make it more real. The second night passed without incident. No calls, no silence, just normal forest sounds. It almost made me doubt what we'd experienced, except that Carl and I both knew what we'd heard. On Sunday morning, as we were preparing to leave, we decided to take a different trail back to where we'd parked the Forerunner. About half a mile from camp, the trail crossed a small creek bed with softer, muddier ground. That's where we saw them. Footprints. Big ones. They were roughly 14 inches long, much larger than either of our boots, but what made my blood run cold wasn't just the size. They had only 3 toe impressions. They weren't perfect tracks. The ground was still pretty firm even here, but there were 5 or 6 clear impressions leading away from the trail into the denser forest. Carl took a stick and measured one of the better prints against his own boot. His size 11 hiking boot was dwarfed by the impression. "Jason," he said quietly, "what the hell are we looking at here?" I couldn't answer him. My mind was racing through possibilities, each more impossible than the last. But after what we'd heard 2 nights before, I was running out of rational explanations. We packed up quickly after that, barely speaking. The drive home was mostly silent too. What do you say after something like that? We made a half-hearted pact to come back with a camera someday, but deep down, I think we both knew we never would. Over the years, Carl and I have talked about that weekend a few times. He's convinced we encountered Bigfoot, or at least something similar. I've tried to stay more skeptical, looking for other explanations. Maybe it was other campers messing with us. Maybe it was some kind of animal I'm not familiar with. But those vocalizations, that wasn't anything natural I'd ever heard before or since, and those footprints with the 3 toes. What sticks with me most is the feeling that whatever was out there that night wasn't just making random animal noises. They were communicating with each other. They were aware of us. They seemed to be discussing us, deciding what to do about these intruders in their territory. I've been camping many times since then, but never back to that part of Sabine National Forest. Some places, I think, aren't meant for us to visit. Some things aren't meant for us to understand. Whatever found us that night in October, I'm content to leave it undisturbed in those deep woods along the river. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet darkness of my bedroom, I swear I can still hear those calls echoing in my memory. And I wonder if, somewhere in those woods, they remember us too. Story 3. I've never told this story outside my family and a few close friends. Most people would think I'm crazy or making stuff up, but I swear on everything I hold dear that what happened to us in the green swamp was real. It's been almost 20 years, and I still wake up in cold sweats sometimes. It started back in 2002. My buddy Jake and I were frog gigging along this creek that runs through my family's property near the Green Swamp in central Florida. The land had been in my family for generations, about 100 acres of dense woods and swampy areas. We'd been gigging frogs since we were teenagers, so this was nothing new for us. That night was particularly dark. No moon, just stars peeking through the canopy. We were wading through the shallow parts of the creek, our headlamps pointing down at the water, moving real quiet so we wouldn't spook the frogs. It was around 11 at night, I think. The air was thick with humidity, and the usual chorus of insects and frogs filled the darkness around us. We'd been at it for maybe an hour when we heard this splash, not like a frog jumping into water. This was bigger, like someone had thrown a cinder block into the creek. Jake and I both froze. I remember the hairs on my arms standing up. "What was that?" Jake whispered. I turned my lantern toward the sound, which came from around a bend in the creek about 30 yards ahead. What I saw next, I still have trouble believing it myself. There was this thing bent over the creek. Grey-ish matted hair covered its body. It was drinking from the water, scooping it up with massive hands. When our light hit it, the creature slowly stood upright. Jesus Christ! It was tall, way taller than a man, even taller than a bear on its hind legs. I'm 6'1", and this thing would have towered over me by at least 2 feet, maybe more. For a split second it just stood there, water dripping from its hands, staring right at us. Its eyes caught the light. They were dark but reflective, like a deer's butt, different, more aware. Then it bolted, not on all fours like you'd expect from an animal, but upright, on 2 legs, crashing through the underbrush and disappearing into the trees. Jake and I didn't say a word. We just turned and ran, splashing through the creek back to my truck. We didn't stop to grab anything we'd dropped. The whole drive home, we barely spoke. What do you say after something like that? I tried to convince myself it was a bear, but bears don't run on two legs like that, not for that distance. And the way it moved, it was fluid, purposeful. I'd seen plenty of wildlife in those woods. This wasn't anything I recognized. The following year, my cousin Mark and his wife Diane moved onto the property with their kids. They put a double-wide trailer on the clearing about half a mile from the creek. I never told them about what Jake and I saw. I figured it was a one-time thing, and I didn't want to scare them or sound like a lunatic. That summer, I got a call from Mark. His kids had been playing down by the creek and found footprints in the mud. Not animal tracks, footprints, human-like, but massive, over 15 inches long. When he showed them to me, my blood ran cold. They were exactly where Jake and I had seen that thing drinking. "What do you think made these?" Mark asked me. I shrugged it off. "Probably just some hunter with big feet," I said, even though I knew better. No hunter has feet that big, and the imprints were too deep. Whatever left them was heavy. Over the next 2 years, Mark and his family experienced things. At first, it was small stuff. Their kids would come running home saying someone was throwing rocks at them while they played near the woods. Not like pebbles, good-sized rocks that would have hurt if they'd connected. But the kids never saw who was throwing them. Then came the sounds. Mark would call me late at night, telling me about deep, rumbling growls outside their trailer. Not like a dog or a wild hog, something bigger, something that made the windows vibrate. They'd hear heavy footsteps circling the trailer at night, and sometimes something would strike the side of the home hard enough to shake the walls. When Mark or his oldest boy would go hunting, they'd feel like they were being followed. Branches would snap behind them, but whenever they turned around, nothing was there. Sometimes they'd find trees broken, not cut or fallen naturally, but snapped about 7 or 8 feet up, the tops twisted off. That takes incredible strength. I started spending more time out there, partly to help Mark figure out what was going on, partly because I was worried about their safety. We'd find weird structures sometimes, branches woven together in ways that didn't seem natural or accidental. We set up game cameras, but they'd either catch nothing or be found torn down and broken. Everything came to a head in August 2005. It was a hot, sticky evening, typical Florida summer weather. Diane was home alone with the kids, while Mark was in town getting supplies. She called me in hysterics around 7:30, just as the sun was starting to set. I raced over there, my shotgun riding in the passenger seat. When I pulled up, Diane was standing on the front steps of the trailer, clutching a baseball bat, her face ghost white. The kids were inside, blinds drawn, doors locked. "It was watching us," she said, her voice shaking. "From right there at the tree line." She pointed to the edge of the woods, maybe 50 yards from their front door. She told me she'd been watering her garden when she felt something staring at her. When she looked up, she saw a large, dark shape standing between 2 pine trees. "At first I thought it was a shadow," she said, "but then it moved. It was huge, Jim, taller than the fence, and it was watching me and the kids." What happened next was what really terrified her. The thing suddenly charged toward the trailer, full speed, covering that 50 yards in seconds. Diane screamed and ran for the door, shoving the kids inside ahead of her. The creature stopped about 20 feet from their front steps, stood at its full height, which Diane estimated at around 8 feet, and let out a roar that she said rattled the windows. "It had teeth," she whispered. "I could see them when it growled at me, and its eyes, they weren't animal eyes. They knew what they were looking at." She described it as having long, black, matted hair covering most of its body, massive shoulders, arms that hung lower than a person's would, and it stood completely upright, like a man. After it roared, it just stood there for a moment, staring at the trailer. Then it turned and walked. Not ran, walked, back to the woods, occasionally looking over its shoulder at the house. Mark came home to find Diane and the kids barricaded in the bathroom with the bat and his hunting rifle. I was sitting on their front porch with my shotgun across my lap, scanning the tree line as darkness fell. Over the next few weeks, we installed security lights all around the property. Mark put up a taller fence and added more cameras. He even got a couple of big dogs, German shepherds trained for protection, but the incidents continued. The dogs would go berserk at night, barking and growling at the darkness beyond the fence. Sometimes they'd refuse to go outside at all, cowering and whimpering by the door. One morning, we found one of the cameras ripped from its mounting about 10 feet up a tree. The SD card was missing. Another time, Mark's truck had what looked like handprints on the hood, but they were huge, with fingers that had to be at least 5 or 6 inches long. The last straw came when Mark's oldest son, Tommy, who was 12 at the time, came tearing out of the woods one afternoon. He was sobbing, his shirt torn, scratches on his arms from running through brush. He said he'd been following a deer trail when he heard something big moving parallel to him through the trees. When he stopped, it stopped. When he moved, it moved. Then he heard a sound he described as like someone trying to talk without knowing how. A deep, guttural attempt at speech. That's when he ran. The family moved out the following month. Mark still owns the land, but no one lives there now. We go out during the day sometimes to maintain the property and hunt during season, but never alone and never after dark. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to explain what we experienced. Some say the Florida skunk ape, others call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what it was, but I know what I saw, what we all saw and heard. The property sits empty now. Game cameras occasionally capture strange images, shadows that don't quite make sense, large figures just beyond the range of the infrared. Every time I visit, I find evidence. Broken trees, strange arrangements of sticks, massive footprints by the creek. I don't tell this story often. People either think you're lying or crazy, but I know what's out there in those woods. Something that stands upright, breaks brush, throws rocks, snaps trees, and leaves footprints no human could make. Something that watches and waits and knows we're there, and sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's watching me still. Story 4. I still get chills when I think about it. It was the winter of 2009, and I was 13 years old. Christmas break had just started, and my family was staying at our cabin in Potter County, Pennsylvania. The whole place was covered in snow, like at least 2 feet of it. I remember being so excited because my brother had left his four-wheeler at the cabin, and I'd been waiting all year to ride it. My name's Connor, and what happened that night is something I've tried to explain to people for years, but nobody ever believes me. Well, except my sister Megan and her friend Jessica, who were there with me. They saw it too. It was 3 days before Christmas. My parents had gone to bed early around 9, and Megan, Jessica, and I were still wide awake. We were bored out of our minds. No internet, crappy TV reception, and we'd already played every board game in the cabin at least twice. That's when I got the idea. Hey, want to take the four-wheeler out? I whispered to them. My brother would have killed me if he knew I was touching his precious ATV, but he was away at college, and what he didn't know wouldn't hurt him. Megan's eyes lit up immediately. Are you serious? Mom and Dad would freak. They're asleep, I said. We'll just go for a quick ride on the trail behind the property, 20 minutes tops. Jessica, who was always up for anything, was already putting on her coat. Let's do it. We bundled up in our winter gear, coats, gloves, hats, the works. It was freezing outside, probably in the low 20s. I remember checking the time as we snuck out the back door. It was 10:15 at night. The moon was almost full, reflecting off the snow and making everything look bright blue. It was beautiful, honestly. I wish that's all I remembered about that night. The four-wheeler was in the shed. I knew where my brother kept the key, taped under the seat. Classic hiding spot. I fired it up as quietly as possible, wincing at every sound. We rolled it away from the cabin before I really gave it gas. Megan sat behind me and Jessica behind her. The trail started about 50 yards from our backyard and went deep into the woods for miles. I'd been on it dozens of times during daylight hours, but never at night. It felt different. The trees made these crazy shadows across the snow, and every now and then, an icicle would fall and make me jump. We were having a blast for about 15 minutes. The cold air whipped at my face, and the girls were laughing and screaming whenever I hit a bump. Then we reached this part of the trail that opened up into a small clearing before continuing deeper into the forest. That's when it happened. The four-wheeler just died, right in the middle of the clearing. No sputtering, no warning. It just cut out. "What happened?" Megan asked, her voice suddenly small in the silence. "I don't know," I said, trying the ignition again. "Nothing. Maybe it's the cold." That's when I noticed the smell. It hit me like a punch to the face. This horrible, rancid odor, like something had died, but was somehow still walking around. Like roadkill mixed with wet dog and garbage that had been sitting in the sun for days. It was so strong, I actually gagged. "Oh my God, what is that smell?" Jessica covered her nose with her glove. "Something dead, maybe," I suggested, but I didn't believe it. I'd smelled dead animals before. This was different. This was worse. That's when we heard it. This high-pitched screaming sound coming from the trees to our right, not like a person screaming, more like animals fighting, but amplified. It made the hair on my arms stand up even under all those layers. "Connor, let's go." Megan's voice was shaking. "Try the four-wheeler again." I kept turning the key, but nothing was happening. The screaming sounds got louder, more agitated. Then they stopped suddenly, and the silence was somehow even worse. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or maybe a tree. But then it moved. It stepped out from behind a massive pine tree at the edge of the clearing, and I felt my entire body go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. This thing was huge. Standing there in the moonlight, I could see it clearly. It had to be between 8 and 9 feet tall. I'm not exaggerating. It towered over everything around it. It was covered in dark, shaggy hair. Not fur exactly, but like long hair that hung from its body. The color was hard to make out in the darkness, but it looked dark brown or black. Its arms were what really freaked me out. They were extraordinarily long, hanging almost to its knees. Its shoulders were massive, like twice as wide as my dad's, and my dad's a big guy. The legs were thick and powerful looking, like tree trunks. For a second, none of us moved. We just stared at it, and I swear it was staring right back at us. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I could see the outline of a large, flat nose and deep-set eyes that reflected the moonlight. Then it let out this deep growl that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. That broke the spell. "Run!" I screamed, frantically trying the ignition again. By some miracle, the engine caught this time. Megan and Jessica had already jumped off and were running alongside the four-wheeler as I started moving. I looked back over my shoulder and saw the creature was following us. It wasn't running. That's the weird part. It was walking, purposefully, steadily, like it didn't need to hurry, like it was making sure we were leaving its territory. The girls were screaming, stumbling through the snow. I slowed down enough for them to climb back on, and then I gunned it. I've never driven anything so fast in my life. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified I'd see it gaining on us. We made it back to the cabin and burst through the door, waking up my parents. We were hysterical, all talking over each other, trying to explain what we'd seen. Of course, they didn't believe us. Dad thought we'd seen a bear, even though I kept telling him bears don't stand 9 feet tall on 2 legs. Mom was more concerned that we'd snuck out and taken the four-wheeler than about what we claimed to have seen. The next morning, my dad humored us by walking down the trail to investigate. He found some broken branches and weird impressions in the snow that he couldn't explain, but nothing conclusive. No footprints. The snow had been too powdery and had shifted overnight. He said a deer probably broke the branches. But I know what we saw. And the more I've thought about it over the years, the more I've realized something important. That thing wasn't trying to attack us. If it had wanted to hurt us, it could have. We were stuck on a dead four-wheeler, completely vulnerable. Instead, it seemed like it was escorting us out, like we had wandered into its space and it was making sure we left. I've done a lot of research since then. I know exactly what we encountered that night. It was a Bigfoot. I don't care how crazy that sounds. I know what I saw. The four-wheeler issue, my brother later told me it sometimes stalls in extreme cold, but that doesn't explain the timing or why it started back up when it did. The smell is something all Bigfoot witnesses report, that unmistakable putrid odor that seems to announce their presence. And the screaming sounds, those match countless other reports too. Jessica moved away the next year, but whenever Megan and I talk about that night, we still get the same sick feeling in our stomachs. Sometimes I have nightmares where I'm back in that clearing, but the four-wheeler never starts again. In those dreams, I see the creature approaching slowly, those long arms reaching out. I've never gone back to that specific trail, even in daylight. My parents sold the cabin a few years later, and I was honestly relieved. Potter County is beautiful, but those woods hold something that most people don't believe in, something that I'll never forget. What bugs me the most isn't that people don't believe me. It's that I'll never understand what that creature was doing there or why it let us go. Was it protecting something? Was it just as surprised to see us as we were to see it? I'll never know. But I do know this. There are things in those Pennsylvania woods that science hasn't explained yet. And on that cold winter night in 2009, 3 teenagers came face to face with one of them. I still can't pass a pine tree without looking behind it just to be sure. Story 5. I've never really shared this outside my family and a few close friends, but I need to tell someone who might actually believe me. This happened back in 2006 when I was 7 years old and my little sister Emily was 5. We lived in this house on a gravel road just outside Dayton, Wyoming, near the base of the Bighorn Mountains. It's beautiful country out there. Lots of trees, wildlife, mountains in the distance, the kind of place where you'd expect to see deer wandering through your yard most evenings. That's actually what we were doing when it happened. Emily and I were pressed up against the living room window around dusk, watching for deer. It had become almost a nightly ritual for us. Mom would be in the kitchen making dinner, and we'd call out whenever we spotted one. "That's 3 tonight," or "Look at the baby one." That sort of thing. We were just normal kids, excited about seeing wildlife. It was early fall, I remember, because the leaves were just starting to change, and there was that crisp feeling in the air. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting this weird orange-gold light across our yard. We'd been standing there maybe 15 minutes, arguing about whether we'd seen something move at the edge of the woods when it happened. At first, I thought it was just a shadow from a tree or something, but then it moved, and it wasn't moving like an animal. It was walking upright on 2 legs, crossing our side yard like it had somewhere to be. I remember my whole body going cold, like someone had dumped ice water down my back. "Emily, do you see that?" I whispered, not taking my eyes off it for a second. She didn't answer, just pressed her little hands against the glass, her mouth hanging open. This thing was massive. I mean, I was a kid, so everything seemed big to me, but even now, thinking back as an adult, I know it was huge, easily over 7 feet tall. It had this incredible bulk to it, like a football player times 3, with shoulders wider than our front door and a chest like a barrel. But what really struck me was the way it moved, smooth but powerful, swinging these impossibly long arms that hung down almost to its knees. The whole body was covered in this thick, shaggy hair, not fur exactly, more like really long human hair, but coarser. In that sunset light, it looked reddish-brown, like rust or old blood. There was no clothing, no backpack, nothing to suggest it was a person in a costume. And trust me, growing up in Wyoming, I knew what bears looked like. This wasn't a bear. We must have made some noise or movement because suddenly it stopped and turned toward our window. That's when I felt my heart practically stop beating. It looked right at us, directly at us, and I swear it knew we were watching it. I'll never forget those eyes. They were dark, almost black, set deep under this heavy brow ridge. The face wasn't exactly human, but it wasn't like any animal I'd seen either. There was intelligence there, awareness. Emily started crying then. She bolted from the window, screaming for Mom, but I couldn't move. I was completely frozen, staring at this creature while it stared back at me. It felt like it lasted forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then it turned and continued walking toward the tree line at the edge of our property. I remember it paused there, at the very edge of the woods, and looked back one more time. Then it did something that still gives me chills when I think about it. It let out this sound. Not a scream or a howl, but this deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the glass and into my chest. It was loud enough that I'm sure Mom heard it from the kitchen. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard before or since. It felt deliberate, like a warning, and then it just disappeared into the trees. 1 second it was there, this massive figure silhouetted against the darkening forest, and the next it was gone, swallowed up by the shadows between the pines. By this time, Mom had come running into the living room. Emily was hysterical, pointing at the window and trying to explain between sobs. I was still standing there, unable to look away from the spot where the creature had vanished. "There was a monster," Emily kept saying. "A big, hairy monster looked at us." Mom did what most parents would do. She tried to calm us down, telling us it was probably just a bear or maybe someone from one of the nearby houses walking through the woods. But I knew better. I'd seen bears my whole life. This wasn't that. "It was walking like a person, Mom," I insisted, "but it was huge and covered in hair, and its arms—" I remember trying to show her how long the arms were, stretching my own out as far as they would go. She could see how scared we were, so she went outside with a flashlight to check. I wouldn't go with her. No way was I going outside after what I'd seen. Emily and I huddled on the couch, listening to the front door open and close, watching the beam of Mom's flashlight sweep across the yard through the window. She came back in after a few minutes. "There's nothing out there, kids. No footprints, no monster." She tried to smile, but I could tell she was a little unsettled by how genuinely frightened we were. We weren't the kind of kids who made up stories for attention. That night, neither of us would sleep in our own rooms. Mom made up a bed for us on the living room floor, but we both kept staring at the windows, terrified that the thing would come back and look in at us. I remember pulling the blanket up over my head, convinced that if I couldn't see out, nothing could see in. The next morning, we refused to go outside to catch the school bus. Mom had to drive us, and even then, we ran from the house to the car like something was chasing us. At school, I tried to tell my best friend what we'd seen, but he just laughed and said it was probably Bigfoot. That was the first time I'd connected what we saw to the idea of Bigfoot, but as soon as he said it, something clicked. The descriptions I'd heard, the few pictures I'd seen in books about mysteries and legends, it fit. When we got home that afternoon, Mom made us go outside with her to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. She walked us all around the yard, even to the edge of the woods where I'd seen the creature disappear. There were no obvious signs of anything unusual, no giant footprints, no broken branches. But I noticed something Mom didn't. Some of the pine needles on the ground seemed disturbed, swept into unnatural patterns, like something large had moved through. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares. I'd wake up convinced the creature was standing outside my window, watching me. Emily stopped looking out windows altogether for almost a year. Mom eventually chalked it up to our overactive imaginations, combined with the shadows of dusk playing tricks on us. But she did start making sure all the doors were locked at night, something she hadn't always been strict about before. The weird thing is, as I got older, I learned we weren't the only ones who'd experienced strange things in those woods. I still live in the same house, inherited it after Mom passed a few years ago. Over the years, I've gotten to know more of the neighbors, people who've lived in this area for decades. Around campfires or at the local bar, after a few drinks, some of them will admit to things they've heard or seen. Old man Jenkins, who lives about a mile down the road, told me he's heard strange vocalization at night. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something in between that echoes off the mountains. The Carson family, who have the property that backs up to the same stretch of woods, said their hunting cameras have captured shadows moving between the trees that are too large to be deer or even elk. A couple of hikers reported feeling watched while on the trails that wind through the foothills, describing an overwhelming sense of dread that made them turn back. One guy swears he found a structure deep in the woods made of branches woven together that was too deliberate to be natural, but unlike anything humans typically build. I've never seen the creature again, at least not clearly. But sometimes, especially around dusk when the light gets tricky, I catch movement at the edge of my vision, a shadow that seems too tall, too broad to be a person. Once, about 3 years ago, I was chopping wood in the backyard when I got that same feeling I had as a kid, like I was being watched. I turned toward the tree line, and for just a second, I thought I saw something move back into the deeper shadows. And that night, I heard it. That same deep, chest-vibrating growl from my childhood. Emily moved away as soon as she could, went to college in California and never came back except for brief visits. She says she doesn't remember that evening clearly anymore, that she was too young, but I notice she still won't look out the windows after the sun starts to set when she visits. I've researched Bigfoot sightings over the years, read all the accounts from the Pacific Northwest and other hotspots. The descriptions often match what we saw. The height, the reddish-brown hair, the long arms. Some reports mention the same feeling of being watched, of the creature seeming to deliberately make itself seen before disappearing. That's what has stuck with me all these years. It didn't seem scared of us. It looked right at us, made that sound, and then left, almost like it was telling us something, marking its territory maybe, warning us to stay away from those woods. I don't know what we saw that evening in 2006. I can't explain it in a way that satisfies the logical part of my brain, but I know what I saw, what Emily saw. Something was there, something that wasn't supposed to exist according to science and reason. And sometimes, when I'm sitting in the living room where it all happened, looking out at the same yard, the same tree line, I wonder if it's still out there. If it's watching me right now, remembering the little boy who once stared back at it through the glass, and I wonder what would happen if I ever ventured deep enough into those woods to find out. Story 6. I never believed in all that cryptid nonsense. Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster. It was all just stories people made up when they saw a bear or a weird-shaped log. At least that's what I thought until last year. It started in November of 2013. I was driving back with my buddy Jason from this livestock auction over in Harrison. We were both tired. It had been a long day checking out some cattle for his dad's farm. It was getting dark, maybe around 6:30 in the evening, and we were on that winding road that runs past Old Man Colson's hayfield, about 15 minutes from my place in Mount Judea. I remember we were just talking about nothing important when Jason suddenly grabbed my arm and said, "Tyler, what the hell is that?" I looked where he was pointing and saw something standing at the edge of the hayfield. At first, I thought it was just a person, but then I realized whatever it was stood way taller than the fence, which is at least 5 feet high. I slowed the truck down, thinking maybe it was a hunter or something, but as we got closer, I got this weird feeling in my stomach. It was just wrong somehow. The proportions weren't right. "Stop the truck," Jason said, and I pulled over to the shoulder. We both sat there just staring. The thing was standing upright, completely upright like a person, but it was massive. It had this thick body covered in what looked like brown fur, not like a bear's fur, more coarse, almost shaggy. The light was fading fast, but I could still see it clearly enough to know it wasn't anything I recognized. Then it started walking, not stumbling or lumbering like a bear on its hind legs. It was walking smoothly, taking steady strides across the ridge. Each step was deliberate even, natural, like that's just how it moved. "Are you seeing this?" I whispered, not wanting to take my eyes off it. "Yeah," Jason said. His voice was shaking. "What the fuck is that thing?" We watched it walk all the way across the ridge until it disappeared over the other side. Neither of us said anything for a good minute. I remember my hands were sweating on the steering wheel, and I had goosebumps all over my arms. "That wasn't a bear," Jason finally said. "No, it definitely wasn't." We drove home in almost complete silence, both trying to process what we'd seen. When I got home, I told my parents about it, trying to sound casual, even though I was still freaked out. My dad laughed it off, said we probably saw a black bear standing up, or maybe a guy in hunting gear. My little sister made some joke about us smoking something we shouldn't have, but my mum got this weird look on her face. Later that night, she pulled me aside and told me that she and my older brother had driven through that same stretch about 15 minutes before us. She said they'd noticed something dark sitting near the edge of the hayfield, but they thought it was just a big stump or something and didn't stop to look. I tried to forget about it, told myself maybe Dad was right, maybe it was just a bear, but I couldn't shake the way it walked. Bears don't walk like that, not for that long, not that smoothly. Fast forward to February 1st, 2014. Jason's older brother Kyle, who had given us endless shit about our Bigfoot sighting, came over to my house around noon, looking pale as a ghost. Kyle's this big guy, played linebacker in high school, not the type to get spooked easily. "You're not going to believe this," he said, sitting down at our kitchen table, "but I think I saw your Bigfoot." He told us he'd been driving back from his girlfriend's place early that morning, around 5 a.m., taking that same road past the hayfield. It was still dark out, but in his headlights, he saw something walk across the road about 50 yards ahead of him. He described it exactly like we had. Tall, walking upright on two legs, but bulkier than a person, covered in what looked like black hair or fur. "It didn't run when my headlights hit it," Kyle said. "It just kept walking like it didn't care, and it moved wrong, like the proportions weren't right." That was enough for me and Jason. If Kyle had seen it too, Kyle, who had laughed in our faces for months, then something was definitely out there. That afternoon, I grabbed my neighbor Ethan and his four-wheeler. We took a spotlight even though it was daytime, figuring we might need to check dark spots under trees or in gullies. We rode all around that area, going slow, looking for any signs. At first, we didn't find anything unusual. Then, Ethan spotted some tracks in a muddy patch near the creek that runs along the edge of the hayfield. They were weird, narrow and foot-shaped, but not like any boot print I'd ever seen. The stride between them was huge, much wider than a normal person could walk comfortably. I took some pictures on my phone, but they didn't really show the scale properly. I wish I'd thought to put something next to them for comparison. We followed the tracks until they disappeared into the rocky ground, heading toward the denser woods. About a week after that, my friend Matt came to visit from Marshall. We were hanging out on my back porch around dusk when we heard something from the direction of the woods that border our property. It was this short, deep roar that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a cougar, wasn't anything I'd ever heard in these woods before. Matt looked at me and said, "What the hell makes a sound like that?" I didn't have an answer. We listened for it again, but whatever made that sound had gone quiet. I told Matt about the sightings, and he looked genuinely disturbed. He'd grown up hunting these hills just like me, and he couldn't explain that sound either. The final incident happened on March 30th. My mom was out collecting eggs from our chicken coop early in the morning, just after sunrise. Our property backs up to a steep hillside, and she happened to look up toward it as she was heading back to the house. She came running inside, the basket of eggs forgotten on the porch steps. She was shaking all over, and at first I thought she'd seen a bear or a mountain lion. But when she caught her breath, she said, "I saw it. That thing you and Jason saw." According to my mom, she'd spotted a large black figure standing upright on the hillside, about 200 yards away. She said it was moving across a section that's so steep most people have to use their hands to climb it. But this thing was walking easily, like the terrain was nothing to it. "It stopped," she told me, her voice still trembling. "It looked right at me, Tyler. It turned its head and looked straight at me. Then it changed direction and went up toward the thicker cover on the mountain." My mom isn't someone who gets scared easily or makes things up. She's practical, down to earth. For her to be this shaken, she must have seen something that really disturbed her. After that March sighting, the appearances stopped. Spring came, then summer, and we didn't see or hear anything unusual again. But those few months changed how I look at these woods forever. 4 different people, 4 separate incidents, all describing the same thing. Something tall, walking upright, covered in hair, moving with a distinct gait that none of us could explain away. I've spent my whole life in these mountains. I know what bears look like, even standing up. I know what all the local wildlife sounds and moves like. This wasn't any of that. I've done some research since then, reading about other Bigfoot sightings in the Ozarks. There are more than you'd think. The descriptions match what we saw: the height, the walking style, the way it seemed unbothered by difficult terrain. I don't go out near that hayfield alone anymore, especially not around dusk. Sometimes I'll be driving that road and get this feeling like I'm being watched from the tree line. Jason feels the same way. Kyle bought a better spotlight for his truck and keeps a camera on his dashboard now. My dad still thinks we all just got spooked by a bear and let our imaginations run wild. Maybe he's right, but the 4 of us who saw it know different. There's something out there in the woods around Mount Judea that shouldn't exist according to science, but it does. I've seen it with my own eyes. What bothers me most isn't the creature itself. It's that if Bigfoot is real, what else might be out there that we don't know about? What other impossibilities are walking around in the dark corners of these mountains while we tell ourselves they're just stories? I keep going back to that moment when it walked across the ridge, those smooth, even steps. No animal I know moves like that. And my mum's description of how it looked right at her, not with fear or aggression, but with what she described as awareness, intelligence. Sometimes I dream about it. In my dreams, I'm standing at the edge of our property, and it's watching me from the trees. Not threatening, just aware, acknowledging, like 2 different species sizing each other up across an impossible divide. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I wouldn't have believed it myself if someone had told me this story 2 years ago. But I know what I saw, and I'll never look at these woods the same way again. Story 7. I still can't sleep right when I think about what happened last August. It's been almost a year, and I've barely told anyone outside my family because I know how crazy it sounds. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened on August 15th, 2016. I was driving back from visiting my cousins, who were camping near the Selway River in the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest in Idaho. It was just after midnight, and I was tired but not sleepy tired, if that makes sense. I'd stayed later than I planned, and we'd been telling stories around the campfire. I was actually pretty alert and in a good mood. Instead of taking the main road back, I decided to use this shortcut I knew about. It's this narrow, winding road that cuts through a ridge north of Red River Hot Springs. Not many people use it, especially at night, but I've driven it enough times to feel comfortable. Plus, it would save me about 40 minutes. The road was completely deserted. No headlights, no tail lights, nothing but my high beams cutting through the darkness. I had the radio off and my window cracked, just enjoying the cool night air and the quiet. The pine trees were thick on both sides, creating these deep shadows that my headlights couldn't penetrate more than a few feet. I was about 20 minutes into this back road when I came around this sharp bend, and that's when I saw it. There was something standing right in the middle of my lane. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe a drunk hiker or someone in a costume playing a prank. It was just standing there, completely still. I tapped my horn once, not aggressively, just a quick beep to alert whatever it was. That's when things got weird. Instead of jumping to the side like a startled person would, this thing took off running uphill in front of my car. And not running like a normal person, it was fast, unnaturally fast, like it covered ground in a way that didn't seem possible. I slowed down, and my headlights caught it clearly for about 10 seconds. I'll never forget what I saw. This thing was covered head to toe in reddish-brown hair, not patchy or different lengths like you'd expect from an animal. It was uniform, maybe 3 or 4 inches long all over its body. It stood about 6 feet tall, but it wasn't lanky. It had this solid, muscular frame that looked powerful. The way it ran was all wrong. It had this stride that was way too long, and it swung its arms in this exaggerated way. Its feet were bare. I remember specifically noticing they were wide and flat and covered in the same hair as the rest of it. No shoes, no clothing, just hair. After running uphill on the road for maybe 50 yards, it suddenly veered right and crashed through some bushes at the side of the road. I heard branches breaking, and then nothing. I sat there for a moment, heart pounding, trying to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to floor it and get the hell out of there, but another part was so stunned and curious that I found myself slowly driving forward to where it had disappeared. I rolled to a stop near where it had gone off the road. I left my engine running and my high beams on, pointing toward the bushes. The road was cut into the hillside there, with a slight drop-off on the right side where the thing had gone. I leaned forward, trying to see over the edge without getting out of my car. That's when I spotted it crouched in the ditch, just off the shoulder, maybe 15 feet away. It was hunkered down, but watching me. I could see its eyes reflecting my headlights, this faint reddish glow that made my skin crawl. Not bright red like in movies, but this dull red reflection that was somehow worse because it looked so real. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Then it did something I still can't explain. It grabbed something from the ground and threw it. I heard a sharp crack as a rock hit the edge of the road near my front tire. Then another one bounced off the gravel ahead of me. That was it for me. I hit the gas and got out of there as fast as I could on that winding road. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see it running after me, but there was nothing but darkness behind me. I didn't slow down until I hit the main road, and I didn't fully relax until I was back in town with other cars around me. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat up with all the lights on until dawn. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes and the way it moved. The next morning, I questioned if I'd imagined the whole thing or if exhaustion had made me hallucinate. I decided I needed to go back in daylight. I know that sounds crazy, but I had to know if there was any evidence of what I'd seen. I waited until around noon when I knew there'd be plenty of light. I drove back to that spot, and my stomach dropped when I found it. There were broken branches exactly where I remembered the thing crashing through the bushes. The vegetation was pushed down in a clear path leading away from the road. But what really got me were the footprints. In a patch of dried mud just off the shoulder, there were these impressions that made my mouth go dry. They were footprints, but not human, way too wide, and with what looked like 5 toes that were spread out more than a person's would be. They were deep too, like whatever made them was heavy. I put my boot next to one for scale, size 11, and these prints were at least 4 inches wider than mine. I tried taking pictures with my phone, but they didn't come out well. The lighting was bad with the sun directly overhead, and the dried mud didn't show the details clearly. I wish I'd brought something better than my phone camera, or maybe some plaster to make casts, but I honestly hadn't expected to find anything. I spent about an hour searching the area and found a few more prints leading up the ridge before they disappeared on rocky ground. I also found a couple of fist-sized rocks that looked like they could have been what it threw at me, though obviously I couldn't be sure. When I got back home, I called my grandfather. He's lived in Idaho his whole life and knows all the local history. When I told him what happened and where, he got real quiet. Then he told me something that made my hair stand on end. He said people have talked about strange creatures in that area for generations. The old-timers called them woods people or ridge walkers. What really freaked me out was when he mentioned that locals call that specific stretch Whistle Ridge, because people have reported hearing strange whooping calls or weird vocalizations there. I hadn't heard anything that night, but just knowing there was a history made everything feel more real. I've spent months researching since then. I've gone down every rabbit hole about Bigfoot sightings in Idaho. There are more reports from that area than I ever would have guessed. Most people keep quiet about it because who wants to be known as the crazy person who saw Bigfoot? But when you start digging, the stories are there. The thing that sticks with me most wasn't its size or speed or even those disturbing red reflecting eyes. It was the intelligence. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. It watched me. It threw rocks to scare me away. It seemed to understand what my car was and that I was inside it. That level of awareness is what keeps me up at night. I've gone back to that area a few times since then, always during the day and always with someone else. I haven't seen anything else unusual, but I can't shake this feeling of being watched whenever I'm there. The forest feels different to me now. Less peaceful, more alive in ways I don't understand. Last week, I was telling my cousin about it, and he mentioned that a friend of his who works for the Forest Service has heard strange vocalizations in that same area. Apparently, they sound like a cross between an owl and someone whistling. The Forest Service guy didn't report it officially because he didn't want to deal with the paperwork or questions, but he avoids that ridge now, especially at night. I know how this sounds. Before it happened to me, I would have thought it was just another tall tale. I've always been skeptical about Bigfoot stories. They seemed like something people made up to explain weird noises in the woods or to scare their friends. But I know what I saw. Those eyes staring at me from the darkness were real. Those footprints were real, and whatever it wasn't human. I still drive that way sometimes during daylight hours, but I always get this knot in my stomach when I approach that bend in the road. And I will never, ever take that shortcut at night again. I don't care how much time it saves. Some things are worth avoiding, even if nobody believes you when you try to explain why. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened that night. Was it really a Bigfoot, some undiscovered species, or something else entirely? I don't have answers, just questions, and the memory of those red eyes watching me from the darkness. Whatever it was, it's still out there in those woods, and that thought alone is enough to keep me on the main roads after dark. Story 8. I've been sitting on this story for over 15 years now. Back in June 2007, I was camping with a bunch of my college buddies in Francis Marion National Forest in South Carolina. We weren't deep in the woods or anything, more like on the edge near Berkeley County. I still think about that night all the time. I've tried to rationalize what I saw, but I just can't explain it away, no matter how hard I try. It was a Thursday night, and we had this whole weekend trip planned. There were 8 of us total, 5 guys including me, and 3 girls. We'd spent the day setting up camp, hiking some trails, and just hanging out. Nothing fancy, just some tents, coolers full of beer, and a decent campfire. Normal camping stuff. Around midnight, the girls got spooked by some noises in the woods and wanted to head back to civilization for a bit. They claimed they needed supplies from the gas station, but I think they just wanted cell service to check their messages. So me, Jake, and Travis volunteered to drive them to the gas station about 20 minutes away. The girls decided they wanted to stay at the gas station for a bit. They had this little attached convenience store that was open 24 hours. So we left them there and headed back to the campsite where Matt and Darren were keeping an eye on our stuff. It must have been around 1 in the morning at this point. We were driving down this long, straight stretch of Highway 45. If you've never been there, it's this two-lane road that cuts right through the forest. Tall pine trees on both sides, and these wooden guardrails in spots where the road runs next to swampy areas. No streetlights, so the only light was from my truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. It was one of those humid South Carolina summer nights, and even with the windows down, it felt sticky. I remember we were listening to some Dave Matthews Band album and talking about what trails we wanted to hit the next day. Travis was riding shotgun and Jake was in the back seat. The road was completely empty. We hadn't seen another car for miles. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just this weird shape behind one of the wooden guardrails on the right side of the road. I slowed down a bit, thinking maybe it was a deer or something. But as we got closer, I realized whatever it wasn't a deer. It was squatting down behind the guardrail in this really weird position, kind of like a person would squat, with its knees up near its chest and arms down by its legs. But even in that crouched position, I could tell this thing was huge. "Hey, what the hell is that?" Travis said, leaning forward in his seat. Jake must have seen it too, because he went completely quiet in the back. As we got closer, our headlights caught it better, and that's when I saw its eyes. They were reflecting our headlights with this weird orange glow, not like the yellow-green you see with most animals. This was distinctly orange, like fire coals, and the size of this thing, even crouched down, it had to be over 5 feet tall. The shoulders were massive, like 4 or 5 feet across. It was covered in this dark hair, not like fur exactly, more like shaggy hair that was either really dark brown or black, hard to tell in the headlights. But the most unsettling part was that as we drove past, it turned its head to follow us. Not just a glance, but this deliberate head turn that kept its eyes locked on our truck. Those glowing orange eyes followed us until we were past it. There was something so aware about the way it watched us. Not like an animal's curious stare. This thing was studying us. I kept driving, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. Nobody said anything for what felt like forever, but was probably just a few hundred feet down the road. Jake finally broke the silence. "Did you guys just see that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "What the fuck was that thing?" Travis said, still turned around in his seat trying to look back. I was trying to process what I'd just seen. I don't know, but it wasn't a person, and it wasn't any animal I've ever seen around here. We debated for about 30 seconds before deciding to turn around and go back. I remember thinking it was a stupid idea, even as I was making the U-turn, but curiosity won out over common sense. When we got back to that same stretch of road, we slowed down to a crawl. The spot where it had been was right near a reflector on the guardrail, so I knew exactly where to look, but there was nothing there, just flattened grass where it had been squatting. We sat there for a minute, all of us staring at that empty spot. Travis wanted to get out and look around, but there was no way in hell I was letting anyone out of that truck. Whatever that thing was, it was big enough to do some serious damage if it wanted to. "Maybe it went into the woods," Jake suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. The thing is, there wasn't much time for it to disappear. We couldn't have been more than 30 seconds down the road before turning around. For something that big to just vanish without a sound, it didn't make sense. "Let's get back to camp," I said, and neither of them argued. The rest of the drive back was tense. We kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see those orange eyes watching us from the darkness. I cranked the music up to fill the silence, but it didn't help much. When we got back to the campsite, Matt and Darren were still up, sitting by the fire. They could tell something was off as soon as we walked up. "What happened to you guys? You look like you've seen a ghost," Matt said, passing me a beer that I immediately opened and chugged half of. We didn't tell them that night. I'm not sure why. Maybe we needed time to process it ourselves, or maybe we thought they wouldn't believe us. We just made up some story about almost hitting a deer on the road, but I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the image in my head, those wide shoulders, the way it was squatting there so deliberately, like it was waiting for something, and those eyes following us. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that orange glow. The next morning, we were all irritable from lack of sleep. The girls came back to camp with some other guys who had driven them, and we spent the day doing normal camping stuff, hiking, fishing in the nearby creek, cooking hot dogs over the fire. But every time I heard a twig snap in the woods, I found myself scanning the tree line. It wasn't until we were packing up the next afternoon that Travis finally brought it up with the whole group. We were breaking down the tents when he just blurted out, "So we saw something weird on the road last night." Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked at him. "It was probably nothing," I said quickly, not wanting to freak everyone out, especially since we were about to spend another night there. But Jake backed him up. "No, man, that was definitely something. That wasn't normal." So we told them what we'd seen. As expected, the reactions were mostly skeptical. "Probably just a hog," Matt said with a shrug. "They get big around here." "No way that was a hog," Travis insisted. "It was sitting like a person." "Could have been a bear," one of the girls suggested. "Bears don't have shoulders like that," I said, "and their eyes don't glow orange in headlights." "Maybe it was just some weirdo in a costume," Darren laughed, "like a hunter or something." But I knew what we saw wasn't a person in a costume. The proportions were all wrong, and the way it moved its head was too fluid, too natural. By the time we finished packing up, most of them had dismissed our story. But that night, I noticed everyone stayed a little closer to the campfire, and nobody wandered off alone into the woods. We left the next morning, and I've never gone back to that specific camping spot. I've been to other parts of Francis Marion since then, but always to more populated sites, and never alone. I've spent years trying to convince myself it was something normal. A bear, a person, some kind of optical illusion from the headlights and shadows. But deep down, I know what I saw. The image is burned into my memory. That massive, hair-covered figure crouched behind the guardrail, those broad shoulders, and those glowing orange eyes tracking us as we drove by. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching from the edge of the woods as cars pass by on that lonely stretch of Highway 45. I wonder if other people have seen it too, but, like me, were too afraid of ridicule to share their story. All I know is that I still get chills when I think about that night, and I still can't explain what we saw. Whatever it was intelligent enough to hide when we came back looking for it. And that's what scares me the most. Not that it was there, but that it didn't want to be seen again. Story 9. I've been a hunter all my life. 43 years of tracking deer, turkey, and the occasional black bear through the Appalachian foothills I call home. My daddy taught me to hunt when I was just a boy, and his daddy taught him. It's in our blood out here. I know these 100 acres of forest behind my house better than I know the lines on my own palm. Every ridge, every hollow, every seasonal creek. But what happened last month has me questioning everything I thought I knew about these woods. It started with the trail cameras. I've got 8 of them set up throughout my property. Nothing fancy, just basic bushnells that capture decent night footage. Been using them for years to track deer patterns, check what's visiting my salt licks, and keep an eye on predator activity. Never had any issues before. About a month ago, I started noticing something strange while going through the weekly footage. Camera 1 by the South Creek crossing showed the usual. Couple deer at dawn, some raccoons, a fox. Camera 2 near the old oak stand was similar, but camera 3, 4, and 5, the ones deeper in the property, were showing almost nothing. Just empty frames, maybe a squirrel here and there, but none of the regular deer traffic I'd expect this time of year. At first, I figured maybe it was just a random lull. Animals change their patterns sometimes, but after a week of this, my gut was telling me something wasn't right. The woods felt different, quieter. I decided to hike out and check the cameras myself, make sure they were still working properly. Camera 3 and 4 were fine, still firmly attached to their trees, batteries good, SD cards recording. But when I hiked the extra mile to camera 5, the one furthest from my house near the north boundary, I found it lying on the ground about 15 feet from the tree I'd mounted it on. The heavy-duty strap I'd used to secure it was snapped clean through, and there were deep scratches in the plastic casing. My first thought was a bear. We get them occasionally, though they don't usually mess with trail cams unless they smell something interesting. I picked up the camera, surprised to see it was still functioning. The housing was damaged, but the internal components seemed okay. I popped out the SD card and headed back home, curious to see what had happened. Back at my kitchen table, I plugged the card into my laptop and started reviewing the footage. The first few days were normal. Same patterns of deer coming through around dawn and dusk, couple of turkeys strutting through mid-morning, the usual raccoons and opossums at night. Then, on day 4, something changed. The footage showed a normal evening. A 6-point buck wandered through around 6:30, a few hours of nothing. Then, around 11:15 at night, the infrared kicked on as something moved in front of the camera. But instead of an animal passing by, the screen suddenly went black, not like the camera had malfunctioned, more like something had completely blocked the lens. When the image returned about 3 seconds later, I nearly knocked my coffee over. Standing directly in front of the camera was something huge. The frame was almost entirely filled with what looked like thick, dark hair or fur, not like a bear's coat. This was longer, shaggier. The creature seemed to be examining the camera, shifting slightly as if looking at it from different angles. I couldn't see a face or really make out a body shape because it was standing too close to the lens. Then a hand, at least I think it was a hand, reached toward the camera. It had what looked like thick fingers, but bigger than any human hand I've ever seen. The palm alone must have been 8 or 9 inches across. As soon as those fingers touched the lens, the footage ended. I sat there staring at my laptop screen for a good 5 minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. Bears don't have hands like that, and the way it had examined the camera seemed deliberate, curious even, like it knew what it was looking at. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs, and the angle made its paw look weird. Maybe it was some kind of camera glitch that distorted the image. But deep down, I knew better. I've seen plenty of bears on my trail cams over the years. This wasn't a bear. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I kept replaying that footage in my head, that massive hand reaching for the camera. Around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard something moving around outside. Heavy footsteps on the edge of the yard, near where the forest begins. My 2 coonhounds, Buck and Ranger, started going crazy, barking and growling at the back door. But when I grabbed my flashlight and looked out, I couldn't see anything. The next morning, I decided to go back to where camera 5 had been. The rational part of my brain said I should just leave it alone, but I needed to know what had been out there. I brought my .30-06 rifle with me this time, though I told myself it was just a precaution. When I reached the spot, I immediately noticed something I'd missed the day before. The ground around the tree was soft from recent rain, and there were footprints in the mud, big footprints. At first glance, they looked almost human-shaped, but way too large, easily 16 inches long and proportionally wide. I could make out what looked like 5 distinct toes on each print. They were deep too, like whatever made them was extremely heavy. I followed the tracks for about 30 yards heading northwest before they disappeared, where the ground hardened up on a rocky slope. Standing there in the suddenly too quiet forest, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. For the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own woods. That night was when things really started to get unsettling. I was sitting on my back porch cleaning my shotgun when Buck and Ranger both stopped dead in their tracks while playing in the yard. Their ears perked up and they both stared intently toward the tree line about 50 yards away. Then they started growling. Not their normal "there's a raccoon" growl, but a deep, threatening sound. I'd only heard them make once before when a black bear wandered too close to the house. But they wouldn't approach the woods. These are dogs that will chase anything. Bears, coyotes, doesn't matter. They've never shown fear. But that night, they wouldn't go past the edge of my yard. They just stood there, hackles raised, growling into the darkness. Then I heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving parallel to my property line, just inside the tree line where my yard light couldn't reach. And breathing, deep, rhythmic breathing that carried through the still night air. Whatever it was big, and it was pacing back and forth at the edge of the woods, just out of sight. I called the dogs back and went inside, bringing my shotgun with me. I spent that night with all the lights on, checking the windows every time I heard a sound outside. The next few nights followed a similar pattern. As soon as dusk fell, the dogs would get agitated. They refused to go out after dark, and I'd hear those same heavy footsteps circling my property just beyond the reach of light. I stopped going out to my back porch after sunset, started keeping my guns loaded and within reach. 6 nights after finding the camera, I was awakened around 2 in the morning by a loud bang against the side of my house, like something massive had slammed into it. The dogs went absolutely berserk, barking and howling like I'd never heard before. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat as I grabbed my rifle and flashlight. I'm not proud to admit it, but I was terrified. Still, this was my home, and whatever was out there was getting bolder. I had to face it. I stepped onto my back porch, rifle ready, and swept my high-powered flashlight across the yard. At first I saw nothing, but then, at the very edge of the beam's reach, I caught movement. I adjusted my aim and froze. Standing just beyond my property line was something I still struggled to describe. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe closer to 8, and completely still, unnaturally still, like it was intentionally trying not to move. It was dark-colored, covered in what looked like shaggy hair, but the feature that made my blood run cold was its eyes. They reflected my flashlight beam like a deer's or coyote's would, but they were positioned all wrong, too high up and too aware. Not animal eyes. There was something behind them that knew exactly what it was looking at. I didn't think, just reacted. I yelled, some garbled threat or challenge, and fired a warning shot into the air. The creature turned then, and the way it moved haunts me still. It was smooth, fluid in a way something that size shouldn't be able to move. No lumbering or awkwardness. It simply turned, and in a few long strides, it was gone, vanishing into the forest with barely a sound. I stood there shaking for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Eventually, I backed into my house, locked every door and window, and sat up until dawn with my rifle across my lap. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't seen it directly since, but I know it's still out there. The feeling of being watched is constant whenever I'm outside. The dogs still won't go near the woods after dark. Sometimes at night, I hear those heavy footsteps circling, keeping just out of sight. I haven't checked my trail cameras again. Part of me wants proof, clear footage I could show someone without sounding crazy. But another part, a stronger part, is afraid of what I might find, afraid that seeing it clearly would make this nightmare too real to deny. I don't know what's living in my woods. I've hunted these hills my entire life and never believed any of the old stories about wild men or forest creatures. But now, I keep my doors locked at night. I don't go into the deep woods alone anymore. And every evening when the sun starts to set, I find myself watching the tree line, wondering if tonight will be the night it decides to step fully into the light. Story 10. I've never really been the type to share this kind of thing publicly. I'm not into cryptozoology or anything like that. I'm just a regular guy who works outdoors a lot and knows the difference between a bear, a moose, and, well, something else entirely. But what I saw that day has been eating at me for nearly 20 years now, and I need to get it off my chest. It was Monday, May 10th, 2004. The date is burned into my memory because it was the day my daughter was getting discharged from Royal Inland Hospital in Kamloops after a pretty scary bout of pneumonia. My wife had been staying with her for 3 days, and I was driving up from Merritt to pick them both up and finally bring our little girl home. I was running late that morning. There had been an issue at work that I couldn't avoid dealing with, and I was already feeling anxious about making my wife wait at the hospital with our daughter all packed up and ready to go. Anyone who's driven the Coquihalla Highway knows it's a beautiful stretch of road, cutting through mountains and valleys. But that day, I wasn't in the mood to appreciate the scenery. It was around 11 in the morning. Clear skies, perfect visibility. I was probably pushing 90 kilometers per hour, keeping an eye out for cops while trying to make up some time. That's when I spotted them. About 300 feet off the highway to my right, there was this small pond. Really, it was more like a stagnant puddle of runoff water than anything else. At first, I just noticed 2 dark shapes standing near the water's edge. My initial thought was fishermen, but my brain immediately rejected that. I've fished all over BC, and nobody would fish in that scummy little pond. There wouldn't be anything in there worth catching. As I got closer, still driving but slowing down a bit out of curiosity, I realized these weren't people. They were standing upright on 2 legs, but they were covered in black hair. Not fur like a bear, straight, shaggy hair that hung from their bodies. The hair was jet black, no brown tint to it at all. There were 2 of them. The bigger one on the left was bent slightly forward toward the water, but even hunched over, it was massive, probably over 7 feet tall. The smaller one was standing completely upright next to it, maybe 5.5 or 6 feet tall. The smaller one was facing toward the highway, toward me, and I swear it tracked my car as I passed by. I could see it had a lighter coloration around what I assumed was its face, almost like a mask or lighter patch of hair. The larger one seemed focused on whatever it was doing at the water's edge. What really struck me wasn't just their size or the fact that they were clearly walking on 2 legs. It was how they moved. When the larger one bent down, I could see the muscles in its upper thigh and hip shifting naturally. It wasn't the awkward movement of a bear standing up or a person in a costume. It was fluid, powerful, and completely natural, like watching an athlete or a dancer move. I've spent enough time observing wildlife to know the difference. I didn't stop. I couldn't. My wife and daughter were waiting, and to be honest, I was too shocked to even consider pulling over. What would I have done anyway? Approached them, taken a picture with my crappy flip phone camera. This was 2004. I didn't even have a camera phone then, so I kept driving, but my mind was racing. I checked my rear-view mirror several times, but the angle of the road had already taken them out of view. The whole sighting lasted maybe 15 seconds, but those seconds are crystal clear in my memory. When I got to the hospital, I was visibly shaken. My wife noticed immediately and asked what was wrong. I made up some excuse about nearly getting into an accident on the highway. I wasn't ready to tell her or anyone else what I'd seen. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who claims he saw Bigfoot. On the drive home, with my wife and daughter sleeping in the car, we passed that same spot. I slowed down as much as I dared without waking them and strained to see the pond. There was nothing there, of course, just a dirty little pool of water surrounded by rocks and scrubby vegetation. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. I kept replaying those 15 seconds in my mind, looking for some explanation. Was it bears? No, the proportions were all wrong, and bears don't stand upright for extended periods like that. Was it people in costumes? In the middle of nowhere, on a Monday morning, with no vehicles parked nearby, and those movements were too natural, too fluid. About a month later, I finally broke down and told my buddy Mike about it over beers. He's the outdoorsy type like me, not prone to flights of fancy. I expected him to laugh it off, but he didn't. He just listened, asked a few questions about the exact location, and then told me about his uncle who'd had a similar experience near Harrison Lake in the 80s. That conversation gave me enough courage to start researching. I found out the Coquihalla corridor has had numerous Sasquatch sightings over the years. There's even a place called Sasquatch Provincial Park, not too far away. The local First Nations have stories about these creatures going back centuries. What I saw that day fits the description of a female Sasquatch and her juvenile offspring. The size difference, the behavior, the way the smaller one seemed more curious, while the larger one was focused on what might have been gathering food or water. It all matches other accounts I've read since then. The thing that still haunts me isn't fear. I never felt threatened by these creatures. What haunts me is the normality of it. They weren't doing anything strange or mysterious. They were just existing. Going about their day, a parent and child, when some human in a Toyota happened to drive by and spot them. I've gone back to that location several times over the years. The pond is sometimes there after heavy rains, sometimes just a damp depression in the ground during dry spells. I've never seen them again, but I've found broken branches high up in trees where no human could reach without equipment, and once a strange pattern of flattened grass that seemed too deliberate to be random. This past winter, I was driving that same stretch again. It was dusk, snowing lightly, and I was alone on the road. As I approached the area where the pond would be in warmer months, I saw something dark move from one stand of trees to another. It was just a glimpse, a shadow really, but the way it moved, fluid, purposeful, upright, made my heart race. I didn't stop then either. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I know how it sounds. If someone had told me this story before it happened to me, I'd have nodded politely while thinking they were either lying or confused. But I know what I saw. I'm a clear-headed person. I don't drink when I drive. I wasn't tired or stressed beyond the normal worry about my daughter. I've spent my entire adult life working outdoors, and I know every animal native to British Columbia. What I saw that day weren't bears, weren't moose, weren't elk, and definitely weren't humans. Sometimes I wonder if they recognize me as a human, if they understand what we are the same way we struggle to understand what they might be. That smaller one, the juvenile, it looked right at me as I drove past. There was awareness there, a recognition that I still can't explain. I'm 58 years old now. I've never had another experience like that day, and I've never been a believer in the paranormal or supernatural. But I believe my eyes and my instincts. I believe what I saw were two Sasquatch, a parent and child, going about their day in a world that increasingly has no place for creatures that wish to remain hidden. I don't expect to ever see them again. But sometimes when I'm hiking or camping in the backcountry, I get this feeling of being watched, not in a threatening way, just observed. And I wonder if they remember me too, the human who drove past their pond that Monday morning in May. I've never reported this officially, never called any Bigfoot research organizations or anything like that. This is the first time I've written it down in detail. I guess I'm sharing it now because I'm getting older, and I don't want this experience to just disappear when I'm gone. What I saw was real. They were real. And somewhere in those mountains between Merritt and Kamloops, they might still be out there, watching as we pass by, unaware or unwilling to believe what's right in front of us. Story 11. I'm not the type to get spooked easily. Been hunting since I was a kid, know these woods like the back of my hand. But what's been happening on my farm this past year has me questioning everything I thought I knew about the wilderness around here. Just yesterday, late September, I was walking the back portion of my property in Jefferson Davis County, checking fence lines like I do every few weeks. It was around 4 in the afternoon, sun still high enough, but starting to cast longer shadows through the trees. I was heading toward this old fallen oak that came down in a storm 2 years back when something caught my eye. The ground around one end of the log looked wrong. Hard to explain exactly, but when you've walked the same land for decades, you notice changes. Leaves had been disturbed, piled in a way that didn't look natural. too deliberate. My first thought was maybe a coyote or fox had been digging, but it didn't look like any animal burrow I'd ever seen. I nudged some of the leaves aside with my boot and immediately froze. Bones. Not just a few scattered pieces like you might find from a deer carcass, but an organized collection of bones with what appeared to be a skull partially buried among them. Now I've field-dressed more animals than I can count. I know what deer skulls look like: coyote, fox, bobcat, even bear. We get them occasionally passing through. This wasn't any of those. The skull was larger than a coyote's, but shaped all wrong for a bear. The jawbone in particular caught my attention. The dental structure wasn't like anything I'd encountered before. I took some pictures with my phone and collected the jawbone, carefully wrapping it in my bandana. This morning I sent it off to a wildlife researcher at the State University who I've corresponded with before about unusual tracks. He's running DNA tests on it now, but the bones aren't what's really got me shaken up. They're just the latest in a string of bizarre incidents, all centered on that same section of my property. Back in January, I was out coyote hunting with my buddy Mike. We were set up near that same fallen oak around 2:30 in the morning. Perfect clear night, nearly full moon, temperature in the low 30s. We'd been sitting silent for maybe 40 minutes when I heard Mike make this strange grunt beside me. "What the hell?" he whispered, hand on his face. Something had hit him just below his right eye. Not hard enough to do serious damage, but enough to leave a mark. I shined my light and found a rock on the ground next to him, about the size of a golf ball, smooth riverstone type. Definitely not something that would have fallen from a tree. Someone or something had thrown it. Before I could process what was happening, we heard it, heavy crashing through the brush about 50 yards behind us. Whatever it was big and moving fast. We both had AR-15s with thermal scopes. But by the time we got turned around, the sound was already fading into the distance. Mike was ready to chase after it, but something in my gut told me to hold back. We waited until dawn and found tracks where the sound had come from. Large impressions in the soft ground, but not clear enough to identify. The spacing between them suggested whatever made them had a stride length of at least 4 feet. A few days later, I was back out there bow hunting with another friend, Chris. We were walking the edge of the clearing near sunset when Chris nudged me and pointed toward the tree line about 80 yards away. There was a figure standing there. At first glance, I thought it might be my cousin Dan, who sometimes hunts the neighboring property. The figure was tall, wide-shouldered, just standing there partially obscured by a pine trunk. I whistled, our usual signal, but instead of whistling back or waving, the figure just froze, completely still. Then it made this sound, a deep grunt that carried across the field, before suddenly bolting into the timber. The way it moved wasn't right, too fluid for its size, covering ground faster than a person should be able to. We both noticed the smell at the same moment, like wet dog, but worse, musky and wild. The scent actually intensified as the figure ran, like it was kicking up more of whatever was causing it. Then just last month, August, my buddy Taylor and I were riding ATVs around the back of the property. It was probably around 10:30 at night, and we'd stopped at the top of this small ridge that overlooks the creek bottom where that fallen oak is. We were just sitting there, engines off, having a beer and shooting the breeze when we heard it. A deep, resonant whoop sound echoed up from the direction of the creek. It wasn't an owl or any other animal call I've ever heard, and I've spent 40+ years in these woods. It was almost like someone trying to mimic a great horned owl, but much deeper, with this guttural quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. Taylor and I looked at each other, and I could tell he was as unsettled as I was. We started our engines and headed back to the house without saying a word about it. Only later, sitting on my porch, did he ask, "What the hell was that noise?" I didn't have an answer. The thing is, all these incidents have happened in the same section of my property, about 30 acres of mixed hardwood and pine that borders a swampy creek bottom. It's always been good hunting land, but in the last year, the deer patterns have changed. Trail cameras show less activity, and what deer do come through appear nervous, heads up, moving quickly. I've felt watched in those woods before. Any hunter who's spent enough time in the wild knows that feeling. But I never felt genuine fear until that rock came flying out of the darkness and hit Mike. That was deliberate, that was intelligent, and that scares me more than any bear or cougar ever could. My wife thinks I'm overreacting, says it's probably just some kids trespassing and playing pranks. But that doesn't explain the skull I found yesterday, or the way that figure moved at the edge of the field, or that ungodly whoop sound that still plays in my head when I'm trying to fall asleep. I've got a game camera set up near where I found the bones now. 3 more spread around that section of the property. I'm hoping they'll catch something, give me some answers. But part of me is afraid of what might show up on those SD cards. The jawbone should be at the lab by tomorrow morning. The researcher said he'd expedite the analysis, but it could still be a couple of weeks before I hear anything. Until then, I'm avoiding that part of my property, especially after dark. Last night, I was sitting on my back porch around midnight, just thinking about everything that's happened. My property backs up to those woods, about 400 yards from the fallen oak. I was about to head inside when I heard 3 distinct knocks coming from the tree line, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. Knock, 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 evenly spaced, deliberate. My German shepherd, who normally barks at every raccoon and possum that crosses our yard, just whined and pressed against my leg, tail tucked. I'm not saying it's a Bigfoot or anything like that. I've always scoffed at those stories, but something is happening on my land that I can't explain. Something intelligent enough to throw rocks with accuracy, to arrange bones and cover them, to make sounds that seem designed to communicate or intimidate. Whatever it is, it's been getting bolder, coming closer to the house. The rock throwing was concerning, but not directly threatening. It could have hit Mike much harder if that was the intent. But it feels like it's testing boundaries, figuring out how I'll respond. I've lived here my whole life. This is my family's land going back 3 generations. I'm not about to be driven off by whatever this is, but I'm also not stupid enough to go walking in those woods at night anymore, at least not without being armed and having someone with me. The part that keeps nagging at me is why now? What changed? These woods have been the same for decades. Why would something suddenly start making itself known like this? The only significant change was some logging on the property adjacent to mine last summer. They cleared about 60 acres of old-growth pine. Maybe that pushed something out of its territory and onto my land. But what kind of animal responds to habitat disruption by throwing rocks and arranging bones? I'm hoping the jawbone analysis will give me some answers. If it turns out to be some known species, maybe just something out of its normal range, I can stop letting my imagination run wild. But if it comes back inconclusive or unidentified, for now, I've told my wife and kids to stay clear of that part of the property. My son thinks I'm overreacting, keeps saying he wants to camp out there and see for himself. Not happening. Not until I know what we're dealing with. The smell is what sticks with me the most, that wet dog, musky odor that seemed to intensify as the figure ran. I've smelled bears before, and this wasn't that. It was distinct, primal. Something deep in my brain recognized it as a warning, so here I sit, waiting for answers, jumping at sounds in the night, and wondering what the hell is living in my woods. These aren't just random occurrences anymore. There's a pattern, a presence, an intelligence behind it all, and until I figure out what it is, I won't be walking that part of my land alone again. Story 12. I still get goosebumps when I think about that January night back when I was 12. It's been over 15 years, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Some things just stick with you, you know? Especially when they defy any logical explanation you try to put on them. We lived in this small neighborhood just outside Willits, California. If you've ever been there, you know it's basically surrounded by coastal redwoods. Our house wasn't anything special, just a single-story ranch style with a decent yard. I shared a room with two of my four younger brothers, which is why I often escaped to the living room couch when I wanted some peace and quiet. That particular night, my parents had gone to some dinner thing with friends from Dad's work. They'd left me in charge of my brothers, though at 12, that basically meant making sure nobody set the house on fire. I'd gotten them all to bed around 8:30 and had the TV to myself for once. It was snowing outside, not super common for our area, but we'd gotten about 4 inches that day. Everything was quiet except for the low volume of some forgettable sitcom I was half watching. I must have dozed off around 10. The house had that heavy silence that comes with snowfall, where everything outside seems muffled. Our heating system made those occasional ticking sounds as it worked, and my youngest brother's nightlight cast this dim glow down the hallway. Normal stuff. Safe stuff. I'm not sure exactly what time it was when I first heard it. Maybe 11:30? Midnight. I just remember suddenly being awake, that weird jolt where you're not sure if something actually woke you or if you just randomly came out of sleep. At first, I thought I'd heard a branch snap outside. We had these big oak trees in our yard, and sometimes with snow weight, they'd drop limbs. I remember lying there, blinking at the ceiling, trying to decide if I should go back to sleep or check it out. That's when I heard a soft scraping against the living room window, the big one that faced the side yard where we had this dense lilac hedge separating our house from the neighbors. It wasn't like someone tapping on the glass. It was more deliberate, like something dragging across it. My first thought was raccoons. We got them sometimes, and they can be pretty bold. But then the sound moved, precisely. From one end of the window to the other, like something tall was walking alongside our house, maintaining contact with the glass the whole time. I sat up, heart suddenly hammering in my chest. The TV was still on, casting blue light across the room, but the volume was so low I could barely hear it. Outside, through the partially opened curtains, I could just see the snowfall had stopped, and everything was this perfect, untouched white. Then it happened. This scream. God, I don't even know how to describe it right. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It started as this high-pitched howl that came from directly behind the wall where our couch was pressed against. It was so close, it was like whatever made it was literally standing on the other side of that wall. The sound was so powerful, I could feel the vibration through the couch. The howl rose in pitch until it hit this point where no human vocal cord should be able to reach, and then it changed. That's the part that still haunts me. It shifted into this bubbling, choking laugh, like something trying to speak but only managing a broken chuckle. It was wet-sounding, like when someone has fluid in their lungs, but also deliberate, controlled, like it was enjoying making that sound. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there, frozen, as this sound continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds. Then it stopped, just cut off mid-sound. The silence afterward was almost worse. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes, at least. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I kept expecting my brothers to come running out, asking what that noise was, but they slept through it. Every part of me wanted to run to my room, lock the door, and hide under the covers until my parents got home. But there was also this other part of me, this stupid, curious part, that needed to know what made that sound. Because if I didn't look, my imagination would create something way worse, right? So I waited. I listened for any other sounds. Nothing. The house was completely silent again except for the heater and the barely audible TV. After maybe 10 minutes of gathering my courage, I finally stood up on shaky legs. I didn't turn on any more lights. I don't know why. Maybe some instinct not to draw attention to myself. I just crept to the window and very, very carefully pulled the curtain back about an inch. The yard was pristine. 4 inches of perfect unmarked snow glowed blue-white under the security light from our neighbor's garage. The lilac hedge between our houses was thick with snow, not a branch disturbed. There were no footprints, nothing. It looked like a freaking Christmas card. That's when the real fear set in, because whatever made that sound had been right there on the other side of that wall. I heard it. I felt it. But there was nothing in the snow to show anything had been there at all. I checked the other windows too, moving through the house as quietly as I could. Same thing everywhere. Perfect, undisturbed snow all around our house. Not even animal tracks. It was like whatever made that sound had appeared out of nowhere and then disappeared the same way. The space between our house and the neighbor's was narrow, maybe 4 feet at most. That lilac hedge took up half of it, and it was dense. You couldn't walk through it without breaking branches, especially with snow weighing everything down. But there was nothing broken, nothing disturbed. The snow between the houses was smooth and untouched. I checked all the doors, locked, windows too. Nothing was open, nothing was damaged. Everything was secure, but I was terrified. I ended up sitting in the hallway where I could see both the front door and my brother's rooms until I heard my parents' car pull into the driveway around 1:30 in the morning. I pretended I'd fallen asleep watching TV when they came in, and I never told them what happened. What was I supposed to say? Hey, there was this thing outside my window that screamed and laughed but didn't leave any footprints. They would have thought I had a nightmare or was making it up. I was 12, already at that age where parents start dismissing the imaginary stuff. But I know what I heard. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't my imagination. Something was outside our house that night, something that could somehow move without leaving tracks in fresh snow. For years afterward, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just weird acoustics carrying some normal animal sound from the forest. Maybe it was the wind through some odd configuration of trees or buildings. I tried to convince myself it was anything but what it felt like. Something intelligent and not human standing just outside my window. Then, about 2 years ago, I was going through one of those YouTube rabbit holes, watching videos about strange forest sounds. I clicked on one titled, Possible Bigfoot Vocalization Near Eureka, CA. I wasn't even thinking about my own experience. I was just killing time. The video started playing and my blood went cold. It was a recording of a scream that dragged out and then cracked into this breathy rumble. It wasn't exactly the same as what I'd heard. This one was more distant, more echoey, but the progression of the sound, the way it shifted from a howl into that broken, almost speech pattern, it was so similar that I actually dropped my phone. I've listened to every animal sound I can find online since then. Bears, mountain lions, elk, even people trying to mimic these creatures. Nothing matches what I heard. The closest is always these supposed Bigfoot recordings. I'm not saying that's what it was outside my window that night. I don't know what it was, but I know it wasn't human, and it wasn't any normal forest animal. And the fact that it left no tracks in the snow still makes the hair on my arms stand up when I think about it. Sometimes I wonder if my brothers heard it too and just never said anything, or if they've had their own experiences they've kept quiet about. We don't talk about this kind of stuff as a family. Never have. All I know is that something was outside our house in Willits that January night. Something that could scream like nothing I've ever heard before or since. Something that could move without leaving tracks in fresh snow. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment at night and I hear an unexpected sound outside my window, I freeze just like I did when I was 12, waiting to hear that bubbling, choking laugh again. Story 13. I still can't believe what we saw last night. I've been on edge all day, jumping at every sound outside my window and constantly checking the tree line behind my house. I've never been the type to believe in cryptids or monsters, but after what happened, I don't know what to think anymore. So it was around 8 in the evening yesterday. The moon wasn't full, kind of waning, not giving off much light. My buddy Jake and I were driving east on 94th Street in his Razer. It's this little off-road vehicle, kind of like a beefed-up golf cart. We'd been out checking some property he was thinking about buying, just cruising along when Jake suddenly jerks the Razer to a stop. "Chris," he says, pointing south toward this hillside, "is that a Sasquatch?" I remember laughing at first. People around here sometimes put up these metal Bigfoot cutouts on their property as decorations or whatever. I figured that's what he was seeing. "Dude, it's probably just one of those metal things people have in their yards," I told him, not even bothering to look closely at first. But as we kept driving, something caught my eye. The figure Jake had pointed to, its arm was moving. Not like something blowing in the wind, but a deliberate, slow, rhythmic motion. Metal decorations don't move like that. "Hold up," I said, feeling the hair on my arm stand up. "Stop the Razer." We pulled over near a fence line at the base of the hill. I can't explain the feeling that washed over me as I focused on what I was seeing. It was unmistakable. Standing there, maybe 100 yards away, was what I can only describe as a Bigfoot. I'm not exaggerating when I say it was massive, easily 7.5 to 8 feet tall. Its head had this distinct cone shape, and it was covered in thick black hair all over. The way it moved was what really got to me. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you might expect from something so big. It walked with these smooth, steady strides over the hill, completely at ease in its environment. Each step it took was purposeful, confident. This wasn't some guy in a costume. The proportions were all wrong for that. Its arms hung lower than a human's would, and the shoulders were just impossibly broad. We sat there frozen for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then, in a moment I'll never forget, it stopped and turned its head to look directly at us. I couldn't make out facial features clearly from that distance, but I could feel its eyes on us. My stomach dropped. I've never felt so small, so vulnerable. After what felt like forever, it just turned away and continued walking, disappearing over the ridge of the hill. "Holy shit," Jake whispered. "Did you see that?" I couldn't even answer at first. My mouth had gone completely dry. "Should we try to follow it?" he asked. Part of me wanted to floor it in the opposite direction, but curiosity got the better of us. We tried calling out to it, which in retrospect was probably stupid. But it didn't react at all, just kept walking away with that same steady pace. We jumped back in the Razer and tried circling around using different roads, hoping to spot it again. My heart was pounding the whole time. We took County Road 8 around to the other side of the hill, thinking we might cut it off, but we never saw it again. It was like it had vanished into thin air, which doesn't seem possible for something that size. Something else strange happened while we were driving around. We noticed there were deer everywhere that evening, way more than usual. At one point we saw 4 deer moving in the same direction the Bigfoot had been heading, almost like they were following it. And when we eventually gave up and headed back to Jake's place, there were 3 more deer just standing in his driveway. Jake's a hunter, and he said he'd never seen deer behaving that way before. We started wondering if maybe the Bigfoot was hunting the deer, and that's why there were so many around, or maybe they were drawn to it somehow. I don't know, but it was definitely weird. One thing that's always mentioned in Bigfoot stories is the smell. People talk about this overwhelming foul odor. But that's the thing. We didn't smell anything unusual. The air was clear, just the usual country smells of dirt and grass. Maybe we weren't close enough, or maybe that's just one of those details that gets exaggerated in stories. All I know is what we saw was real and it didn't stink. I couldn't sleep at all last night. I kept replaying the whole thing in my head. The way it moved, the way it turned and looked at us. I've been hunting in these woods my entire life, and I've never seen anything that matched what we saw yesterday. Not even close. This morning, I drove back out there at first light. I had to see if there was any evidence. Anything at all that would confirm what we saw wasn't just some shared hallucination or something. I parked where we had stopped the night before and walked the fence line, looking for tracks, hair, anything. I didn't find much, just a single hair caught on the barbed wire fence. It was long and coarse, but when I examined it closely, it looked more like deer hair than anything else. No footprints that I could find, though the ground was pretty hard and rocky in that area. As I stood there looking up at that hill, I got this overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. The woods were dead quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just silence. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that when the forest goes quiet like that, it usually means there's a predator nearby. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I've been researching Bigfoot sightings in our area all day. Turns out there have been dozens of reports over the years, many of them describing exactly what we saw. The height, the cone-shaped head, the black hair. Some reports mentioned them traveling in groups, but ours was definitely alone. Jake called about an hour ago. He sounds as shaken as I feel. He said he told his wife about what happened, and she thinks we're both crazy. I don't blame her. If someone had told me this story 2 days ago, I'd have thought they were full of shit or had been drinking, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs. I've seen plenty of bears in my life. It wasn't a person in a costume. The movements were too natural, too fluid for that. And it certainly wasn't one of those metal cutouts. I keep asking myself why it was there, out in the open like that. Most Bigfoot sightings happen deep in the woods, not walking over a hill near a road. Was it just passing through? Was it looking for food? Was it watching us the same way we were watching it? And why didn't it react when we called out? Could it not hear us? Did it not care? Or maybe it understood exactly what we were and wanted nothing to do with us? I can't say I blame it if that's the case. I'm going back out there tomorrow with a better camera. Jake thinks I'm crazy, says we should just leave it alone. Maybe he's right, but I need to know for sure. I need something concrete, something I can point to and say, see, this is real, this happened. The rational part of my brain keeps trying to come up with explanations. Maybe it was just a really tall person walking across their property. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion caused by the fading light. But then I remember the way it moved, the shape of its body, how it turned and looked right at us. And I know better. I've lived in these parts all my life, and I've never believed in monsters or cryptids or any of that stuff. I'm the guy who laughs at those Finding Bigfoot shows. But now I don't know what to believe. If you're reading this and you've had a similar experience around here, especially near 94th Street or County Road 8, please reach out. I need to know I'm not going crazy. I need to know someone else has seen what we saw. I keep replaying that moment when it turned and looked at us. There was something so deliberate about it, like it was assessing us, deciding whether we were a threat. And apparently, we weren't worth its time. That's what keeps me up at night. Not fear that it might come after me, but the realization that it viewed us with the same casual interest that we might view a squirrel or a rabbit while hiking. We weren't predators to it. We weren't even worth changing its path for. I've always thought humans were at the top of the food chain around here. Now I'm not so sure. I'll update if I find anything tomorrow. For now, I'm keeping my doors locked and my rifle closed. Not that I think it would do much good against something that size, but it makes me feel better. Has anyone else seen anything like this? Am I losing my mind? I need answers, because right now, my entire understanding of the world has been turned upside down by a 7-minute encounter on a dim evening on 94th Street. Story 14. I still can't explain what I saw last October. I'm not the type who believes in monsters or gets spooked easily. I've spent most of my life in the Colorado mountains, hiked countless trails, and dealt with everything from aggressive moose to mountain lions. But what happened in that canyon above Fairplay has been eating at me for months, and I need to get it off my chest. It was early October 2022, probably around the 4th or 5th. The aspens were turning that incredible gold color they get before winter, and I had a rare day off from my construction job. I decided to take advantage of the perfect weather, crisp but not cold, maybe around 55 degrees with barely any clouds. I packed light, water, trail mix, my hunting knife, habit, and a light jacket tied around my waist. I'd hiked these mountains dozens of times before and knew what I was doing. I drove out to this trail about 20 minutes outside Fairplay. It's not one of those popular touristy spots. Just a narrow, beautiful canyon that cuts between two ridges, with pine forests covering most of it and some rocky outcrops that make for great views. I got there around 1 in the afternoon, parked at the small pull-out area where maybe 3 cars can fit, and started up the trail. The first mile or so is pretty easy, just a gentle incline through pines with occasional clearings. I was enjoying the quiet. No city noise, no co-workers, just the sound of pine needles crunching under my boots and birds calling occasionally. I remember thinking how good it felt to be alone out there. About 20 minutes in, the trail narrows as you enter the lower section of the canyon. The walls start to rise up on either side, not straight cliffs, but steep slopes covered in pines with occasional rock faces jutting out. The trail follows a dry creek bed most of the year, though in spring it can get pretty wet with snowmelt. I was looking down, watching my footing over some loose rocks, when something made me look up. I don't know if it was a sound or movement or just that weird feeling you get when you're being watched. But when I raised my head, I saw something on the ridge to my right, maybe 100 feet above the trail. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it as something familiar, a bear standing up maybe. But no, this thing was standing right at the edge of one of those rocky outcrops, perfectly upright on 2 legs. It was massive, broader across the shoulders than any person I've ever seen. The height was hard to judge from that angle and distance, but at minimum, it was as tall as a large man, possibly taller. What really struck me was the color, a deep reddish brown, like rust or old copper. The entire body was covered in thick fur that moved slightly in the breeze. I could make out the basic shape clearly against the blue sky behind it. The wide shoulders tapering to a narrower waist, long arms, and a somewhat conical head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders without much of a neck. I froze completely. I didn't dive for cover or anything dramatic, just stood there, barely breathing. The creature wasn't looking at me. It was facing toward the upper part of the canyon, completely still except for that slight movement of fur in the wind. It seemed to be watching something up ahead, or listening. There was an intentness to its posture that reminded me of a predator tracking prey. For several seconds, maybe 10 or 15, though it felt much longer, neither of us moved. I was afraid to even shift my weight. Then, without any apparent hurry, it turned away from the edge and walked off. Just walked. On 2 legs, moving with a fluid, deliberate gait that was unnervingly human-like, but also not. It disappeared into the tree line without making any sound I could hear. I realized I'd been holding my breath and let it out slowly. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I stood there for several minutes, scanning the ridge, trying to spot it again or make sense of what I'd seen. Nothing moved up there. The strange thing was the silence. No warning calls from birds. No smell. I've heard stories about these creatures having a strong odor, but I didn't notice anything. No sounds of branches breaking or rocks falling as it moved. Just this massive being appearing and then vanishing like it was completely at home in that environment. I should mention I'm not some city slicker who wouldn't know a bear from a boulder. I grew up hunting with my dad in these mountains. I've tracked elk, dodged moose, and once had to back away slowly from a mountain lion. I know our wildlife. This wasn't anything I recognized. After the initial shock passed, I had to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around and get the hell out of there, but curiosity and a stubborn streak kept me going. I continued up the canyon, but I was moving differently now. Slower, scanning the ridges constantly, stopping to listen every few minutes. My hand kept drifting to my knife, though what good a 4-inch blade would do against something that size, I don't know. The canyon opens up into a small valley about a mile further in, with a stream and meadow surrounded by denser forest as it stretches toward the higher mountains. I made it there, half expecting to see the creature again, but there was nothing unusual. just the normal sounds of water running over rocks and occasional bird calls. I stayed for maybe half an hour, unable to fully enjoy the spot as I normally would, then headed back down through the canyon. On the return hike, I couldn't stop looking up at that ridge where I'd seen it. The question that kept running through my mind was, what was it watching for? It clearly wasn't interested in me. It seemed completely focused on something further up the canyon. Was it hunting? Keeping track of other creatures like itself? I felt like I'd accidentally glimpsed something that wasn't meant to be seen, like I'd stumbled onto the periphery of something much larger happening in these mountains that most people never notice. When I got back to my truck, I sat there for a long time with the engine off, trying to process what I'd seen. I've always been skeptical about Bigfoot stories. They seemed like the kind of thing people made up after too many beers around a campfire. But what do you do when you see something with your own eyes that shouldn't exist? I didn't tell anyone at first. My girlfriend would have thought I was pulling her leg. My buddies at work would have turned it into an endless joke. My dad might have believed me, but he passed away 2 years ago. So I kept it to myself, replaying the encounter in my mind, questioning if I'd really seen what I thought I saw. But the details haven't faded or changed over time like a dream would. I remember exactly how the light hit that reddish fur, how deliberately it moved, how it seemed to be performing some kind of surveillance of the canyon. The image is burned into my memory. About a week later, I went back. I'm not sure what I expected to find. Footprints would have been long gone, and I didn't really think I'd see the creature again. But I needed to revisit the spot to convince myself it had really happened. I hiked up to where I'd been standing, then climbed a game trail to get as close as I could to the ridge where it had stood. The area was just normal forest, pine needles, some rocks, fallen branches. No obvious signs that anything unusual had been there. But standing in that spot, looking down at the trail and then up toward the valley, I realized something. The creature had been positioned at almost the perfect vantage point to observe both the approach from below and the upper canyon. If you were setting up surveillance, that's exactly where you'd stand. Since then, I've done some research online. There have been other sightings in Park County over the years, though not many. Most describe creatures with dark brown or black fur, not the reddish color I saw. Some mention strange vocalizations or wood knocking, but my encounter was completely silent. I've read theories about these beings using systems of lookouts and sentries, communicating across distances to warn each other about human presence. That would fit with what I saw. A sentinel keeping watch over a territory. I've gone back to those mountains several times since, though not alone. I bring a friend or two now, and always a better camera than my phone. I haven't seen anything unusual again, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm the one being watched now, not in a threatening way, just observed. Sometimes a branch will crack in the forest with no wind, or I'll turn quickly and catch what seems like movement at the corner of my vision. The encounter has changed how I see these mountains I thought I knew so well. They seem bigger somehow, more mysterious, harboring secrets I never suspected. I find myself scanning ridgelines, looking for that distinctive silhouette. I listen more carefully to the sounds of the forest, wondering if I might catch some communication I don't understand. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know how it sounds. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I'd have nodded politely while thinking they were full of crap. All I know is what I saw with my own eyes. A massive, fur-covered bipedal creature that moved with purpose and intelligence, completely at home in wilderness, where it had no right to exist according to science. The image that stays with me most isn't actually of the creature itself, but what it implies. If these beings are real, if they've been living alongside us in these mountains all this time without being documented or captured, what does that say about our understanding of the world? How many other impossible things might be true? I still hike those trails. I still love these mountains, but now I move through them differently, more carefully, more humbly, with the constant awareness that I might not be at the top of the food chain after all. And sometimes, when I'm on that trail through the canyon, I find myself looking up at that rocky outcrop, half hoping, half fearing that I'll see that reddish figure again, standing sentinel over its hidden world. Story 15. I still wake up some nights thinking I hear that breathing outside my window. It's been almost 8 months since it happened, but I can't shake it. Never thought I'd be one of those people posting about weird experiences, but honestly, I don't know where else to turn. Let me start by saying I'm not some conspiracy nut. I spent 42 years working as an electrical engineer in Cincinnati before retiring last year. My wife passed away 3 years ago from breast cancer, and after spending a couple years alone in our too-big house, I decided to do what we'd always talked about, buy a small camper and see the country. It was nothing fancy, just a 16-foot casita pull behind, perfect for one person. Small kitchen area, a table that converts to a bed, and just enough storage for the essentials. I'd taken a few short trips around Ohio to get comfortable with towing and camping, but this was my first big adventure, a 6-week journey to the Pacific Northwest and back. The first week went perfectly. I took my time, staying at state parks and established campgrounds. By the second week, I was feeling more confident. That's when I decided to try some dispersed camping in national forests. You know, those free spots off Forest Service roads where you can just pull over and camp? I'd read about them on some RV forums, and people said they were the best way to experience nature without crowds. That particular day, I'd been driving through northern Idaho. It was early October, beautiful fall weather, and I'd spent most of the day exploring some small towns along the way. Around 4 in the afternoon, I turned onto a Forest Service road, following my GPS. The road was rough, but passable in my Ford F-150. After about 3 miles in, I found this perfect little clearing about 30 yards off the main road. It was ideal, relatively flat, with a small fire ring someone had made with rocks, surrounded by tall pines and some birch trees with yellow leaves. No other campers in sight. Complete solitude. I backed the casita in, unhitched, and set up camp. The clearing was maybe 50 feet across, just big enough for my truck, camper, and a small sitting area. Dense forest surrounded the entire spot. I remember feeling so peaceful that evening. I built a small fire, cooked some trout I'd caught the day before at a lake, and sat reading my Kindle as the sun went down. The temperature dropped pretty quickly once the sun set, and by 9 o'clock it was probably in the low 40s. I put out the fire, brushed my teeth, and climbed into bed around 10. This is where things get difficult to explain. I'd been asleep for maybe 2 hours when something woke me. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The camper was rocking slightly, which happens sometimes if there's a good breeze. I rolled over, trying to get comfortable again. That's when I heard it. Footsteps circling my camper. They were slow, deliberate steps, heavy, not like a deer or smaller animal. Each step made a distinct crunch on the fallen leaves and pine needles. I froze, suddenly wide awake, listening intently. The steps continued around the perimeter of my camper, slow and measured. My first thought was bear. I'd taken all the precautions, no food outside, everything secured. But bears are curious creatures. I lay perfectly still, hoping it would just sniff around and leave. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside my window, which is at the head of my bed. I could hear breathing, deep, rhythmic breathing, like something was standing there just inches from where my head was. I was about to reach for my phone to call for help, though I knew there was no service out there. When it happened, the entire camper lurched violently to one side, then back the other way. It was like being on a small boat in rough water, except I was parked on solid ground. Something was physically rocking my camper. The force was incredible. Dishes clattered in the cupboards, books fell from the shelf, and I had to grab the edge of the bed to keep from being thrown onto the floor. This wasn't just pushing. It felt like something had grabbed the frame of my camper and was forcefully shaking it back and forth. The rocking continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I was terrified, completely frozen in panic. Then, somehow, survival instinct kicked in. I shouted as loud as I could, "Hey, get away from there!" My voice cracked with fear, but I kept yelling. I scrambled to grab the pepper spray I keep next to my bed. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped it. The rocking suddenly stopped. Complete stillness followed, but I could still hear the breathing. Deeper now, faster, like whatever it was had gotten excited by the commotion. It was right outside my window. The thin aluminum and glass, the only thing between us. I could hear each inhale and exhale, powerful lungs drawing in and pushing out air. I sat up in bed, pepper spray clutched in my sweaty hand, and tried to control my own breathing, which was coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't dare turn on a light, didn't dare look out the window. I just sat there, listening to that breathing, wondering what the hell was out there. The breathing continued for at least a minute. Then, without any sound of footsteps walking away, it just stopped. Complete silence. I strained my ears, but couldn't hear anything moving around outside. It was like whatever had been there had simply vanished. I sat motionless for what must have been 2 hours, pepper spray in hand, too terrified to move. Every creak of the camper settling, every whisper of wind made me flinch. I kept expecting the rocking to start again, but it didn't. Eventually, I must have fallen into an exhausted adrenaline crash sleep, because the next thing I remember is weak morning light filtering through my window blinds. I checked my watch, 6:45 in the morning. I sat up, feeling disoriented and half convinced I'd had a terrible nightmare. But then I saw the disarray in my camper. Books on the floor, a mug broken in the sink, items shifted in the cabinets. It had been real. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to just hitch up and get the hell out of there without even stepping outside. But I needed to know what had happened, what had been out there. After another 30 minutes of working up my courage, I carefully opened the camper door, pepper spray still in hand. The morning was cold and misty, with fog hanging between the trees. I stood in the doorway, scanning the clearing. Nothing seemed out of place. My truck was untouched. The fire ring was as I'd left it. I took a deep breath and stepped down onto the ground. That's when I noticed the soil around my camper. It had rained lightly earlier in the week, leaving the ground soft enough to hold impressions. And there they were, footprints. But not like any footprints I'd ever seen. They were shaped like human feet, with 5 toes, a ball and a heel, but massive. I wear a size 10 shoe, and these prints were easily 3 times that size. They circled my camper exactly where I'd heard the footsteps, with several prints concentrated right outside my window. My hands trembling, I grabbed my phone and took several photos of the prints. I even placed my own foot next to one for scale. The depth of the impressions suggested whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I didn't stay to investigate further. Within 20 minutes, I had hitched up the camper and was driving back down that Forest Service road, going too fast for the conditions, not caring about what damage I might do to my suspension. I spent the rest of my trip staying exclusively in populated campgrounds with other people nearby. I couldn't bring myself to try dispersed camping again. Every night, I'd lie awake listening for those footsteps, that breathing. When I got home to Cincinnati, I showed the photos to a few friends. They all had the same reaction, raised eyebrows, awkward smiles, and some version of, "That's wild, man." No one came out and said they didn't believe me, but I could tell they thought I was exaggerating or had misinterpreted what happened. I've spent hours researching online. I've looked at reports of bear encounters, but bears don't walk bipedally for extended periods, and they don't have feet shaped like oversized human feet. I've read about mountain lions, wolves, and every other predator in the Pacific Northwest. The only thing that matches what I experienced, the footprints, the strength, the behavior, is what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I was never a believer in that stuff before, I used to think people who claimed to see such things were attention seekers or had active imaginations. Now I don't know what to think. All I know is something found my camper that night, something large enough and strong enough to rock it like a toy, something that breathed like a large mammal but moved silently enough to disappear without a sound. I still have the photos of those footprints on my phone. Sometimes I look at them, half hoping to find some explanation that makes sense. But there isn't one, at least not one that fits into the world as I understood it before that night. I haven't told many people this full story. It sounds crazy even to my own ears. But I know what I experienced. I know what I heard and felt and saw. Something was there with me that night in the Idaho forest. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. I've sold the casita since then. Can't bring myself to sleep in it anymore. I still travel, but I stick to hotels now. Sometimes I wonder if I should go back to that clearing to see if there's any evidence still there. But honestly, I'm terrified of what I might find, or worse, what might find me again. Story 16. I've never been the type of person to believe in monsters or cryptids. I used to laugh at those TV shows about Bigfoot hunters stumbling around in the woods with night vision goggles. That all changed last summer, and I still get chills thinking about it. I live in Meadville, Pennsylvania, a pretty quiet town where nothing much happens. My girlfriend Sarah lives about 1.5 miles from my place, and between our houses is this huge open field. The north side of the field borders this dense line of trees that eventually connects to the Erie National Wildlife Refuge. I never thought much about those woods until what happened. It started on a Wednesday night. I'd been at Sarah's house watching movies until around 11:30. Her parents have this rule about me not staying too late on weeknights, so I headed home like usual. The field is a shortcut I've taken hundreds of times. It saves me about 20 minutes compared to walking around on the roads. That night was particularly dark. No moon, just stars, and the field was completely empty. I was using my phone flashlight, which wasn't great, but enough to see where I was stepping. I was about halfway across when I heard it the first time. Heavy footsteps and branches snapping in the tree line to my right. At first, I thought it was probably a deer. We get them all the time around here. But something felt off about the sound. The footfalls were too heavy, too deliberate, and whatever it was seemed to be keeping pace with me, walking parallel to my path but staying in the trees. I stopped walking, and the sound stopped too. Complete silence. I told myself I was being paranoid and started walking again. Immediately, the footsteps resumed. Stop. They stop. Walk. They walk. This wasn't a coincidence. My heart started pounding. I picked up my pace, and whatever was in those trees matched me step for step. It wasn't running away from me. It was following me. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt this knot form in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a coyote. But I've heard coyotes before, and they don't make footsteps that sound like that. These were heavy, like something big was deliberately placing each foot down. When I was about 100 yards from the edge of the field, I couldn't take it anymore. I sprinted all the way home, my lungs burning by the time I reached my back door. I didn't tell anyone what happened. It sounded stupid even in my head. Something followed me in the woods. Yeah, right. I convinced myself it was just an animal, and my imagination making it seem scarier than it was. The next night, Thursday, I was at Sarah's again. We were working on a project together, and I lost track of time. When I left, it was almost midnight. I considered taking the long way home on the streets, but that would add 20 minutes to my walk, and I was tired. So I decided to cross the field again. I was on edge from the beginning, keeping my eyes on that tree line the whole time. For the first 5 minutes, everything was quiet. I started to relax, thinking whatever I'd heard yesterday was gone. Then it started again. The same heavy footsteps, the same snapping twigs. Only this time, it sounded bigger somehow, more purposeful. Just like before, when I stopped, it stopped. When I walked, it walked. But now I could hear breathing, deep, heavy breaths that carried across the open space between us. I felt like I was being hunted. My mouth went completely dry, and my legs felt weak. I pulled out my phone and tried to shine the light toward the trees, but it wasn't strong enough to penetrate the darkness. All I could see were the first few feet of brush, and then nothing but black beyond that. But I knew something was watching me from in there. I could feel its eyes on me. This time, I didn't wait. I ran almost immediately, and I swear I could hear whatever it was running alongside me in the trees, keeping pace effortlessly. The sounds it made crashing through the underbrush were terrifying. Branches breaking, leaves rustling, but with this weird rhythmic quality that made it clear this wasn't just some animal randomly moving around. When I got home, I was shaking so bad I could barely get my key in the door. I went straight to my room and spent hours researching what kind of animals live in the eerie wildlife refuge. Nothing I found matched what I'd experienced. Bears don't stalk people like that. Mountain lions might, but they're rare here, and they don't make those kinds of heavy footsteps. By Friday, I was seriously freaked out. I considered canceling my plans with Sarah, but she'd been looking forward to our Friday night hangout all week. I decided I'd go, but I'd take the long way home, no matter how late it was. We had a great night, played board games with her little brother, watched some Netflix. Around 11:15, I headed out, determined to stick to the streets. But Sarah's dad mentioned there had been a couple of break-ins reported over on Maple Street, which was exactly the route I'd need to take. He seemed concerned about me walking that way alone at night. So there I was, standing at the edge of the field again, trying to work up the courage to cross it. I texted my dad to let him know I was on my way home, just in case. Then I started across, walking faster than normal, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. For the first few minutes, there was nothing. I started to think maybe whatever it was had moved on. Then I heard it again, those same heavy footsteps, only this time something was different. The sounds weren't just keeping pace with me, they were moving diagonally, cutting across my path ahead. My blood ran cold. The previous nights it had been content to just follow me from the trees. Now it was moving to intercept me. I froze, not sure what to do. Running back to Sarah's would mean turning my back on whatever was coming. Going forward meant potentially meeting it head-on. As I stood there paralyzed with indecision, the most horrible smell hit me. This foul, sour odor that made my eyes water. It was like rotting meat mixed with something musky and animal-like, but stronger than anything I'd ever smelled before. It was so intense I actually gagged. Then I felt it more than saw it. Something massive moving past me about 15 yards ahead, crossing from right to left. The grass in the field swayed with its passage. I couldn't make out details in the darkness, just a large, dark shape moving with surprising silence for its size. I didn't think. I just ran, sprinting across the field toward my house. I could hear it changing direction behind me, moving faster now. The sounds of footsteps were heavier, more urgent. Whatever this thing was, it was big, and it was fast. My house sits on a slight hill above the field. I was halfway up our backyard when some primal instinct made me stop and turn around. My dad had installed these bright floodlights that illuminate most of our yard and part of the field beyond. In that harsh white light I saw it. It was standing by our clothesline pole, perfectly still, watching me. The thing was enormous, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It was completely covered in dark brown hair, not like fur exactly, more like long, shaggy hair. Its chest was massive, barrel-shaped, with shoulders twice as wide as any humans I've ever seen. Its arms hung down almost to its knees. I couldn't see its face clearly. It was keeping its head slightly lowered in shadow, but I could feel it looking at me. We just stood there, staring at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 20 seconds. Then I heard my dad call my name from inside the house. The creature's head snapped in the direction of his voice, and in that moment I ran to the back door. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before getting inside. My dad asked what was wrong. Said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I couldn't even speak. I just went to my window and looked out, but the thing was gone. Disappeared completely, as if it had never been there. I spent the whole night researching Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania. There have been hundreds reported over the years, many of them in the northwestern part of the state where I live. The descriptions matched what I saw. The height, the build, the long arms. Even that terrible smell is commonly reported. What still haunts me is the progression over those 3 nights. First night, it tracked me from the trees. Second night, it followed me more aggressively. Third night, it intercepted my path and then revealed itself in the light. Like it was getting bolder each time, or maybe curious, testing boundaries. I haven't taken the field shortcut since that night. Sarah thinks I'm being ridiculous, walking the long way around. I haven't told her what happened. I haven't told anyone except you guys here. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I'm in my room at night with the window open, I swear I can hear heavy footsteps at the edge of our property and catch a whiff of that same foul smell on the breeze, like it's still out there, waiting. Story 17. I still remember that day, in the summer of '92, like it was yesterday. I've tried to forget, tried to convince myself that what we saw was just a black bear, or my mind playing tricks after a long day in the woods, but I can't lie to myself anymore, and I need to get this off my chest, even if most people will think I'm crazy. My buddy Rick and I were bow hunting in the hills near Wayne National Forest in Ohio. We'd been friends since high school and went hunting together at least twice a month during season. That particular day in July, we'd been out since before sunrise, sweating our asses off in the humid summer heat, with nothing to show for it, not even a glimpse of a deer. By late afternoon, we were both frustrated and exhausted. The temperature must have been in the high 80s, and the humidity made it feel like we were walking through soup. My clothes were stuck to my skin, and I had mosquito bites all over my arms, despite the repellent we'd sprayed on ourselves that morning. "Let's call it a day," Rick had said, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. I agreed, and we started making our way back to the truck, which was parked about a mile away on an old logging road. The woods were thick in that area, lots of underbrush and fallen trees to navigate around. We were walking single file, with Rick about 10 feet ahead of me. I remember checking my watch. It was around 6 in the evening, and even though we still had plenty of daylight left, I was ready to get home, take a cold shower, and crack open a beer. We'd been walking for maybe 15 minutes when we heard it. A loud crash, like something big smashing through branches. At first I thought it might be a deer, and my heart rate picked up with excitement. Finally, some action. But what happened next? I still get goosebumps thinking about it. There was more crashing, coming from the ridge to our right. Rick had stopped dead in his tracks, and I nearly bumped into him. We both instinctively raised our bows, but we weren't prepared for what came barreling down that hillside. It was massive. That's the first thing I remember thinking. This thing was running down the ridge on 2 legs, moving faster than any human could through that terrain. It was covered in long, shaggy black hair that hung from its body and swung with each stride. Its arms, Jesus, its arms were incredibly long, swinging at its sides and reaching down near its knees as it ran. I couldn't move. I literally could not make my body respond. Rick was frozen too. We just stood there, our bows half raised, as this thing crossed the path about 30 yards in front of us, and then it turned its head and looked at us. I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It wasn't fully covered in hair like the rest of its body. The face was almost bare, and the skin looked blackish, like dried mud with cracks in it. Its eyes, I couldn't make out the color, but they were deep set under a prominent brow ridge, and they locked onto us for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a second or two. Even though it was running bent forward, this thing had to be over 7 feet tall. It was built like a linebacker, but taller and broader than any human I'd ever seen. The muscles under that hair were obvious. This wasn't some scraggly creature. It was powerful. As quickly as it appeared, it was gone, disappearing down the hill on the other side of the path. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 5 or 6 seconds. Rick and I just stood there in shock. I remember my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mouth had gone completely dry, and my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my bow. "What the fuck was that?" Rick finally whispered, his voice cracking. I couldn't even answer. My brain was trying to process what we'd just seen. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't run on 2 legs for that distance. It wasn't a person in a suit. No one could move that fast through the underbrush, and the proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, the shoulders too wide. We looked at each other, and without saying a word, we both knew we needed to get the hell out of there. We started walking faster toward the truck, no longer caring about being quiet or staying in single file. Every few steps, I'd look over my shoulder, convinced that thing was following us. We'd gone maybe 100 yards when we heard it, a scream that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was loud, echoing through the trees, starting high-pitched and then dropping lower, before rising again at the end. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before, not a bobcat, not a fox, not a person. It was primal and sent a chill straight through me despite the summer heat. Rick grabbed my arm. "Run," he said, and we did. We ran through that forest like our lives depended on it, jumping over fallen logs and pushing through thickets that tore at our clothes and skin. I don't think either of us had ever moved so fast. When we finally reached the truck, we threw our gear in the back and jumped in, locking the doors. Rick's hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. I kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see that thing emerge from the forest at any moment. The drive home was mostly silent. What do you say after something like that? We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear with mange. Maybe it was some kind of prank. Maybe we were both suffering from heat exhaustion and hallucinated the whole thing. But we both knew what we'd seen. "We can't tell anyone about this," Rick finally said as we neared town. "They'll think we're crazy or on drugs." I agreed. Who would believe us? I barely believed it myself, and I'd seen it with my own eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face looking at me. Those eyes. I kept hearing that scream echoing through my head. I got up several times to make sure my doors and windows were locked. The next day, Rick called me. "I've been doing some research," he said. There was something different in his voice, excitement mixed with fear. He came over with printouts from the library about Bigfoot sightings in Ohio. Some of the descriptions matched what we'd seen. The height, the long arms, the dark hair. There were even reports of similar screams. We spent hours going through those articles, finding more and more similarities. It was both terrifying and comforting to know that other people had seen something like what we encountered. Over the next few weeks, we debated whether to report our sighting to someone, maybe a local Bigfoot research group or the Forestry Service. But in the end, we decided against it. It was the 90s. People would have thought we were attention-seeking idiots, and we both had reputations and jobs in our small community. The strange thing is, we kept going back to hunt in that same area over the years. At first, we were nervous, always hunting together and keeping our eyes and ears open for any sign of that creature. We'd jump at every snapped twig or rustling bush. But as time passed and we never saw it again or heard that blood-curdling scream, we started to relax a bit, but I never completely forgot. Sometimes, when I'm in the woods alone, I'll get this feeling like I'm being watched. I'll scan the trees and underbrush, half expecting to see that figure standing there, looking at me with those deep-set eyes. Rick and I don't talk about it much anymore. It's been over 30 years now, but occasionally, when we've had a few beers and we're alone, one of us will bring it up. "Remember that thing we saw back in '92? And we'll both go quiet, reliving those few seconds when our understanding of the world changed forever. I've tried to find logical explanations over the years. I've researched black bears extensively, studied the wildlife in Wayne National Forest. even looked into the possibility of escaped exotic pets. Nothing fits what we saw that day. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know how it sounds. If someone told me this story, I'd probably think they were full of shit too. But I know what I saw. I know what Rick saw, and whatever it wasn't supposed to exist in the hills of southeastern Ohio. The image that haunts me the most isn't even the creature itself. It's the moment it turned and looked at us. There was intelligence in those eyes, recognition. It knew we were there, and it made a decision to keep going rather than approach us. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if it had made a different choice. I haven't been back to that specific spot in years. Not out of fear exactly, but out of respect. Whatever that thing was, it was just living its life in those woods when we stumbled into its territory. It had as much right to be there as we did, maybe more. I still hunt, still spend time in the forests of Ohio, but I'm more aware now, more observant, more respectful of the fact that there might be things out there we don't understand. Creatures that have managed to stay hidden from human eyes for centuries. That day changed me, not in any dramatic way that others would notice, but inside. It opened my mind to possibilities I'd never considered before. It made me question what I thought I knew about the world. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the forests of Wayne National, if it's raising young ones, teaching them to avoid humans and their noisy machines, if it's watching hikers and hunters from the ridges, staying just out of sight. I don't know if I'll ever get answers. Part of me doesn't want to. Some mysteries should maybe stay mysteries. But I know what I saw that summer day in '92, and no amount of rationalization will ever convince me otherwise. That thing was real. Those eyes were real. That scream was real. And somewhere deep in the forests of Ohio, it might still be there, watching and waiting as we pass by, unaware.